Part 1. The Confrontation. Get that filthy child away from me. Do you have any idea who I am? Alexandra Harrington's voice sliced through the cabin of a Flight 892 like a diamond-tipped blade. Her French manicured fingers clutched a $3,500 Hermes scarf to her face as if it were an oxygen mask in contaminated air. The scent of her Clive Christian perfume, $800 per ounce, created an almost visible barrier between her and the offending child. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner sat motionless on the O'Hare tarmac. All 247 passengers now trapped in aluminum limbo as the drama unfolded in premium economy. The recycled air felt suddenly thick and stale. The overhead reading lights cast harsh shadows across tense faces. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Reynolds watched the security feed with growing concern. His jaw clenched so tight that a muscle twitched beneath his graying temples. 32 years of spotless service. Over 22,400 flight hours without a single incident. And now this. Have you ever witnessed someone with power humiliate someone without it? And wondered what you'd do if you could actually stop it, like not just post about it later, but actually intervene in real time. The timestamp on the security feed read 9:37 p.m. CT. Boarding had been completed 4 minutes ago. They were already running 7 minutes behind schedule due to air traffic congestion. Every minute on the ground cost Atlantic Global Airlines thousands of dollars. But some things cost more than money. On the feed, Marcus could see a small black child, no more than 8 years old, shrinking back against her father as Alexandra Harrington continued her tirade, now jabbing her finger toward the girl's chest. The little girl clutched a worn stuffed dinosaur like a shield, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. 9:37 p.m. CT, Marcus noted mentally. The incident begins. Captain Reynolds' background. Marcus Reynolds hadn't become one of Atlantic Global's most respected captains by accident. At 52, his career spanned more than 3 decades of exemplary service, beginning with 12 distinguished years in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation. The worn edges of his family photo tucked inside his flight manual told the story of what really mattered to him. His military background had shaped him profoundly. As a former Air Force major with 2 commendations for leadership under pressure, Marcus approached his role as captain with an unwavering commitment to integrity and the safety of everyone on his aircraft. He'd flown through sandstorms in the Gulf, navigated hostile airspace during military operations, and commanded squadrons with a precise balance of authority and compassion that earned him the nickname Steady Reynolds among his peers. The framed photograph on his desk at home showed him in his Air Force dress uniform, arm around his wife Diana, a high school principal whose strength matched his own. Their daughter Amara was now in her 2nd year of medical school at Johns Hopkins, following her parents' example of service and excellence despite the financial strain it placed on the family. You don't compromise on the important things, Marcus had told Amara when she'd called last week, anxious about a difficult ethics case. Not ever. Even when it costs you. Even when it gets your attending's approval, she'd asked. Especially then. He'd answered. The memory of that conversation hung in his mind now as he watched the security feed. In the cockpit of Flight 892, First Officer Miguel Hernandez completed the pre-flight checklist with efficient precision. At 36, Miguel represented a newer generation of pilots, technically impeccable, commercially minded, and sometimes skeptical of what he considered Marcus's old-school approach to command. Systems check complete, Captain, Miguel reported, his voice carrying the slight remains of his Honduran accent despite 20 years in the United States. Ground crew confirms all clear. We're running 7 minutes behind schedule already. Corporate's been pushing on-time metrics hard this quarter. Thank you, Miguel. Marcus scanned the instruments with practiced ease, his dark brown eyes missing nothing. Let's see if we can't make up some time over the Atlantic. The contrast in their approaches was subtle but significant, where Miguel prioritized efficiency and on-time performance metrics that determined bonuses. Marcus had always placed his concept of command integrity first. It wasn't that he disregarded schedules, his on-time rating was among the airline's best, but that he understood aviation as a human enterprise first and a technical one second. I'm going to do my walkthrough, Marcus said, unbuckling his harness. Miguel raised an eyebrow. Still doing that, huh? It's not in the procedure manual anymore. Last time I mentioned it in the pilot's lounge, some of the younger guys called it boomer aviation. Some traditions exist for a reason, Marcus replied with a slight smile. Rising from his seat, his knees cracked slightly, a reminder of the thousands of flight hours in his body. A machine can fly a plane. It takes a human to command it. It was a ritual from his military days that he'd never abandoned, greeting the cabin crew personally, establishing his presence, and doing his own visual inspection before every flight. The passengers rarely noticed, but the crew always appreciated this small acknowledgement of their shared mission. As he stepped out of the cockpit, Marcus straightened his uniform jacket and adjusted his captain's hat, the 4 gold stripes on his epaulets gleaming under the cabin lights. In his philosophy, the uniform wasn't just for show. It represented a covenant of responsibility to every soul on board. The time was 9:42 p.m. CT. Boarding was nearly complete, and Flight 892 was scheduled to depart in 18 minutes. Marcus had no way of knowing that his routine walkthrough was about to place him at the center of a confrontation that would change not just his career, but an entire industry. Dr. Nathan Williams and Zoe. Dr. Nathan Williams guided his 8-year-old daughter Zoe through the narrow aisle of the aircraft, gently steering her past the first-class cabin toward their premium economy seats. At 44, Nathan carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had overcome significant obstacles to become one of Chicago's leading pediatric neurosurgeons. "Almost there, Zoe Bear. Just a few more rows," he said softly, noticing his daughter's wide-eyed fascination with the airplane's interior. The recycled air had that distinctive airplane smell, a mixture of cleaning products, upholstery, and the lingering scent of coffee from the galley. Zoe clutched Rex, her well-worn stuffed Tyrannosaurus, in one hand and a small box of apple juice in the other. The dinosaur's once vibrant green fabric had faded to a pale mint. One eye was slightly loose, and the stuffing had been compressed from years of hugs. Rex had been a gift from her mother before she passed away from an aggressive form of breast cancer 2 years ago. Since then, Rex had become Zoe's constant companion, especially during moments of transition or uncertainty. And this was certainly a moment of transition. Nathan had accepted a prestigious 1-year fellowship at London's Royal Children's Hospital, where he would pioneer an innovative microsurgical technique for pediatric brain tumors. The opportunity was career-defining, but the decision to uproot Zoe from the only home she'd ever known had weighed heavily on him. "Is that our seats, Daddy?" Zoe pointed to row 10, the premium economy bulkhead seats they'd been assigned. Her voice sounded smaller in the confines of the aircraft. Vulnerable. "That's it, Sweet Pea, 10A and 10B. Nathan smiled, watching his daughter's expression shift between excitement and apprehension. "You can have the window if you'd like." Their preparation for this move had been meticulous. Nathan had enrolled Zoe in an international school with an excellent reputation, found an apartment within walking distance of a park she might like, and arranged video calls with her new teacher. He'd explained that London would be an adventure, that she'd make new friends, and that they'd come back to visit Chicago during holidays. Still, the anxiety in her eyes was unmistakable as she sipped her apple juice and peered around the busy cabin. "Will Rex need his own seatbelt?" she asked, her voice small against the background of passenger conversations and overhead bin closures. "He can share yours," Nathan replied, helping her into the window seat. "He's not quite big enough for his own. Plus, I think he'd be scared without you holding him." This earned him a tiny smile. Victory in the ongoing battle against the grief that sometimes ambushed Zoe at unexpected moments. Nathan had deliberately booked premium economy for the extra space and attention, knowing that Zoe's first transatlantic flight might be challenging. The bulkhead seats offered additional legroom and priority service, small comforts that he hoped would make the 8-hour journey easier for them both. As Zoe settled in, Nathan noticed her watching the passengers in first class with innocent curiosity. The opulent pod-style seats with their amenity kits and pre-flight champagne service seemed to fascinate her. "Those seats turn into beds," he explained, following her gaze. "Maybe someday we'll try those." "When I'm a doctor like you," Zoe asked, momentarily forgetting her nervousness. "Exactly, Pav," Nathan smiled, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and sorrow that his wife wasn't here to see the remarkable little person their daughter was becoming. The ache of her absence never quite disappeared, just changed form over time. The announcement system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're completing the boarding process for Flight 892 to London Heathrow. Please ensure your carry-on items are properly stowed and your seatbelts are fastened. Nathan checked his watch, 9:42 p.m. CT. If all went according to schedule, they would be in London tomorrow morning, beginning their new chapter. He helped Zoe with her seatbelt, carefully arranging Rex on her lap. "Ready for our big adventure?" he asked. Zoe nodded, but her grip on Rex tightened. Neither of them could have anticipated that their adventure would begin right here on the tarmac, in a confrontation that would change the trajectory of lives far beyond their own. The incident erupts. As Nathan helped Zoe adjust her seatbelt, she reached for her juice box on the armrest. Her small hand, still developing its fine motor coordination, knocked the box sideways. A small splash of apple juice, no more than a teaspoon, arced through the air and landed on the pristine white designer shoe of the woman walking past them toward the first-class lavatory. "Disgusting," Alexandra Harrington shrieked, recoiling as if she'd been struck by something caustic. She yanked her foot back, her face contorting in outrage. The overhead lights caught the massive diamond on her left hand as she gesticulated wildly. "My God, these are $2,500 Louboutins. Look at what you've done." The sudden outburst startled Zoe, causing her to drop Rex. When she bent to retrieve him, her head accidentally bumped Alexandra's purse. "Control your child," Alexandra snapped, her voice rising several decibels. The conversation around them instantly died. That peculiar aircraft silence where tension seems to vibrate in the pressurized air. Nathan immediately stood up, his 6'2" frame unfolding carefully in the confined space. "I am so sorry, ma'am. It was an accident. Let me help clean that up for you." He reached for the cocktail napkin under his water glass, but Alexandra stepped back as if his hand were a weapon. The scent of her exclusive perfume mixed with the artificial cabin air, creating an almost visible barrier between them. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "This is exactly why there should be child-free flights, or at least child-free premium sections." Nathan maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Again, I apologize. It's just a small amount of juice. It should wipe right off." Alexandra's gaze shifted from Nathan's face to Zoe, who was now on the verge of tears, clutching Rex to her chest. Something in Alexandra's expression changed, hardened as she took in their appearance, the quality of their clothing, the worn stuffed dinosaur. "I'm sorry," Zoe whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient cabin noise. A single tear tracked down her cheek, dropping onto Rex's faded head. Instead of accepting the child's apology, Alexandra seemed to grow even more indignant. She turned toward the flight attendant who was approaching, summoned by the commotion. "These people are harassing me," Alexandra announced loudly, emphasizing these people with unmistakable disdain. "First they assault my property. Then they refuse to control their child." The "you" people hung in the air, thick and toxic. Nathan froze, the napkin still in his hand. As he processed the woman's words, his expression shifted from apologetic to a cold, controlled quiet. The type of silence that medical professionals develop when confronted with the unacceptable, but must maintain professionalism. Flight attendant Carmen Diaz, a 10-year veteran with Atlantic Global, assessed the situation quickly. She was 34, with an efficient manner and the experienced calm of someone who had handled countless passenger conflicts. "Ma'am, is there a problem I can help with?" Carmen asked, her tone professional but warm. "Yes, there's a problem." Alexandra gestured toward Nathan and Zoe. "This person's child has ruined my shoes, and now he's making excuses instead of offering proper compensation." Carmen glanced down at the shoe in question, noting the tiny spot of juice that was barely visible on the white leather, literally a drop that could be wiped away in seconds. "I'd be happy to get you some club soda for that spot, ma'am," she offered. "It should come right out." Alexandra's face flushed, 2 spots of color appearing high on her cheekbones. "That's not the point. The point is that they shouldn't be up here in the first place. Look at them." Her gaze swept dismissively over Nathan's sensible button-down shirt and Zoe's simple dress from Target, lingering on Rex with visible disgust. The implication was unmistakable. Several nearby passengers looked up from their pre-flight routines, sensing the escalating tension. "Ma'am," Nathan said, his voice now carrying a careful, measured tone, "my daughter apologized for the accident. I've offered to help clean your shoe. What more would you like us to do?" "I want you moved," Alexandra declared loudly. "Move them to the back of the plane where they belong." A collective intake of breath rippled through the nearby rows. The racial subtext had just become text. The cabin suddenly felt even smaller, the air thicker. Carmen's professional smile faltered for just a moment. "Ma'am, Dr. Williams and his daughter are properly ticketed for these premium economy seats. I'm sure we can resolve this small issue without—" "Do you know who I am?" Alexandra cut her off, raising her voice further. "I'm Alexandra Harrington. My husband is Howard Harrington of Harrington Financial Group. We're Atlantic Global's largest private investors." She pulled out her phone, tapping it aggressively. "I'm calling Howard right now. He'll have all your jobs if you don't handle this appropriately." By now, several passengers had begun recording the interaction on their phones. Among them was Olivia Jackson, a 35-year-old financial reporter for the Wall Street Journal, who had recognized Alexandra's name immediately and started documenting the incident from her seat across the aisle. "I don't care if these tickets were some kind of charity case or diversity initiative," Alexandra continued, her voice carrying throughout the front cabin. "I will not sit in the same section as people who don't know how to behave in civilized society." Zoe began to cry silently, big tears rolling down her cheeks as she hugged Rex tighter. Nathan placed a protective hand on her shoulder, his expression now completely transformed from apologetic to resolute. "My tickets were purchased at full price, Ms. Harrington," he said quietly, "and I would appreciate it if you would refrain from speaking about my daughter and me in those terms." "What terms?" Alexandra shot back. "I'm simply stating facts. Look at your child, causing problems before we even take off. Look at that ratty toy. People like you should fly economy if you want to be disruptive." A 20-something passenger in row 8 muttered to his seatmate, just loud enough to be heard, "Big Karen energy right now. This is about to get so ratioed." His companion was already typing on her phone. "OMG, wait till TikTok sees this. She's giving major main character syndrome." The timestamp on Olivia Jackson's recording read 9:47 p.m. CT. Within minutes, the video would begin its journey across social media platforms. But for now, the conflict remained contained within the pressurized cabin of Flight 892, where every word echoed with devastating clarity. Captain's decision. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Reynolds watched the security feed with growing concern. The confrontation in premium economy was escalating beyond a typical passenger dispute. He could see Carmen Diaz attempting to defuse the situation, but Alexandra Harrington's body language and the reactions of surrounding passengers indicated this was no ordinary conflict. The tension in the cabin was palpable even through the small monitor. "What's happening back there?" First Officer Hernandez asked, noticing Marcus's attention on the security monitor. "Passenger dispute," Marcus replied, his eyes not leaving the screen. "Looks like it might be getting out of hand." The cockpit phone buzzed. Marcus answered immediately. "Captain, this is Carmen. We have a situation in premium economy that might require your attention. I'm watching on the monitor. Give me details." Marcus responded, his tone calm but authoritative. "Passenger Alexandra Harrington in 2C is demanding we relocate a father and daughter from their assigned premium economy seats after a minor juice spill. She's using problematic language, sir. Racial implications." Marcus's expression darkened. "How's the crew handling it?" "I've offered solutions, but she's escalating. Sir, she's mentioned being connected to Harrington Financial Group and being a major investor in the airline. She's threatening to call her husband to have us all fired." Marcus noted the timestamp 9:48 p.m. CT. They were now 13 minutes behind schedule. First Officer Hernandez was already checking the fuel calculations and potential arrival delay. "Captain," Hernandez interjected, "if we don't push back in the next 7 minutes, we'll miss our takeoff slot. That could mean an additional 40-minute delay." His fingers drummed nervously on the armrest. "The quarterly bonuses are tied to on-time performance. Just saying." Marcus acknowledged this with a nod, but remained focused on the security feed. He could see that several passengers were now recording the confrontation. The little girl was crying. The father was standing with contained dignity despite the verbal assault. "We should notify operations that we might have a delay," Hernandez suggested, his concern for the schedule evident in his tight voice. "They can alert Heathrow about our adjusted arrival time." "Not yet," Marcus decided. "Let me address this personally." Hernandez looked surprised. "Sir, with respect, that's what the cabin crew is for. We're already behind schedule, and procedure doesn't require captain intervention for passenger disputes. His voice lowered. Plus, Harrington Financial Group, isn't that the firm that's financing our Asian expansion? Maybe we should just have Carmen move the family. Might be easier for everyone. The suggestion hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Marcus stared at his first officer for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Sometimes procedure isn't enough. Miguel, Marcus finally replied, unbuckling his harness again. Keep monitoring our status. I'll be back shortly. Against protocol and Hernandez's obvious disapproval, Marcus left the cockpit, securing the door behind him. He moved down the aisle with purposeful strides, his presence immediately registering with the passengers who straightened in their seats as he passed. The captain's uniform still carried weight in the strange microcosm of an aircraft cabin, one of the few remaining spaces where formal authority was visibly marked and generally respected. As he approached the confrontation, he could hear Alexandra Harrington's voice clearly. And I'll have your job for this. Do you understand who you're dealing with? My husband practically owns half this airline. Carmen looked relieved to see the captain approaching. The surrounding passengers were a mixture of uncomfortable, outraged, and, increasingly, documenting the scene on their phones. The distinctive sound of iPhone camera shutters clicked repeatedly in the tense cabin air. What seems to be the issue here? Marcus asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. The cabin immediately grew quieter, all eyes turning to the captain. Alexandra turned, momentarily surprised by the captain's presence, but quickly recovered her indignation. Finally, someone with actual authority. Captain, these people have assaulted me and damaged my property. I demand they be removed from this section immediately. Marcus took in the scene with experienced eyes. The tiny juice stain on Alexandra's shoe, the tearful child clutching her stuffed dinosaur, the father standing with quiet dignity, the surrounding passengers with their recording phones. The smell of tension in the cabin was distinctive, a mixture of stress pheromones, perfume, and the constant artificial circulation of the ventilation system. Ms. Harrington, I'm Captain Marcus Reynolds. I understand there was an accidental spill. It wasn't just an accident, she insisted, tapping her designer shoe against the carpet for emphasis. They're being disruptive and disrespectful. Don't you know who I am? I'm Alexandra Harrington. My husband is... I'm aware of who your husband is, ma'am. Marcus interrupted politely but firmly. However, on this aircraft, I'm the final authority, regardless of who's on board. A passenger in row 7 whispered audibly to his seatmate. Oh, snap. Captain's not playing. Alexandra's face flushed deeper. Are you interrupting me? Do you have any idea how much influence my husband has with your superiors? One call from me and... Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice remaining measured but carrying unmistakable authority. I've reviewed the situation, and from what I can see, there was a minor accident that has been addressed. Dr. Williams and his daughter have apologized. Our flight attendant has offered a solution for your shoe. That's not good enough. Alexandra's voice rose again, her designer bracelet jangling as she gestured dramatically. These people don't belong in premium economy. It's obvious they're not used to this level of travel. Move them back where they belong. The racial undertone was now impossible to ignore. A murmur rippled through the watching passengers. In seat 4F, Olivia Jackson continued recording, her journalistic instincts recognizing that this was no longer just an entitled passenger meltdown, it was something far more significant. The cabin lights reflected off dozens of phone screens as more passengers began documenting the confrontation. Marcus straightened to his full height, his face betraying no emotion save for a slight tightening around his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was lower but carried throughout the suddenly silent cabin. Ms. Harrington, on this aircraft, every properly ticketed passenger belongs exactly where they're seated. What doesn't belong on my aircraft is discriminatory behavior. Alexandra's mouth opened in shock. Discriminatory? How dare you accuse me of... I'm not making accusations, ma'am. I'm stating what I've observed. Marcus turned slightly to address Dr. Williams. Sir, on behalf of Atlantic Global Airlines, I apologize for this disruption. Nathan nodded silently, his hand still protectively on Zoe's shoulder. Marcus turned back to Alexandra, whose face had transformed into a mask of rage and disbelief. Ms. Harrington, I have two options to offer you. You may return to your seat and continue this flight without further comment on this matter. Or if that's not acceptable, I can arrange for you to take a different flight. You can't be serious, Alexandra sputtered, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do you know what will happen to your career when Howard hears about this? You'll be flying cargo planes in Alaska by the end of the week, if you're lucky enough to still have a license. Marcus didn't flinch. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the distant whine of the idling engines. My responsibility is to ensure the safety, security, and dignity of everyone on this aircraft. That's non-negotiable. Alexandra's voice dropped to a threatening whisper. You're making a career-ending mistake. Captain, my husband will have your job before this plane lands in London. That may be, Marcus acknowledged with surprising candor. But right now, then, I need your decision. Will you return to your seat without further incident, or would you prefer to take another flight? The cabin held its collective breath. Alexandra looked around, suddenly aware of the many phones recording her response. Her gaze hardened as she made her choice. This is outrageous. I will not be treated this way. My husband will hear about every detail of this incident. Marcus nodded once. I understand. In that case, I'll need to ask you to gather your belongings. A customer service representative will assist you with rebooking. You're removing me, not them. Alexandra's voice rose to a near shriek. Yes, ma'am, that's correct. Marcus turned to Carmen. Please call security to assist Miss Harrington and help her with her luggage. As Carmen moved to the phone, Marcus addressed the cabin at large. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this delay. We'll be departing as soon as possible. A young woman in row 11 whispered to her friend, Did he really just... Oh my God, this is going straight to my IG story. Her friend nodded, already typing. Hashtag Captain Integrity. This is about to blow up. The timestamp was 9:53 p.m. CT. Captain Marcus Reynolds had just made a decision that would alter the course of his 3-decade career, challenge a powerful financial empire, and ultimately transform an entire industry's approach to passenger dignity and corporate accountability. What he couldn't know, as he returned to the cockpit with Alexandra Harrington's threats echoing in his ears, was that this moment of principle would soon be viewed by millions around the world. Part 2. Immediate consequences. Removal and departure. This is absurd. You'll regret this. Alexandra Harrington's voice echoed through the cabin as 2 uniformed security officers escorted her toward the exit. Her designer carry-on rolled awkwardly behind her, pulled by a flight attendant who maintained a professional expression despite the stream of invective being directed at the entire crew. I'm calling Howard right now. Alexandra brandished her phone like a weapon, the case encrusted with what appeared to be actual diamonds. You'll all be looking for new jobs tomorrow, a passenger in row 15 whispered. Someone's about to get absolutely ratioed when this hits Twitter. Captain Reynolds had returned to the cockpit, leaving Carmen Diaz and the security team to manage the removal. Passengers watched in stunned silence, many still recording as the scene unfolded. The distinctive blue glow of phone screens illuminated faces throughout the cabin. Alexandra paused at the aircraft door for one final pronouncement, her voice pitched to carry to the furthest rows. You, she pointed directly at Dr. Williams. This is your fault. And you, her finger moved to Carmen, can kiss your career goodbye and tell your captain he's finished at this airline. With that, she stormed off the jet bridge, her designer heels clicking furiously against the floor. The cabin remained silent for several seconds after her departure, as if collectively exhaling a held breath. Then, something unexpected happened. Scattered applause broke out, quickly spreading until most of the aircraft was clapping. Carmen turned to address the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be pushing back from the gate shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and all electronic devices are in airplane mode. In the cockpit, First Officer Hernandez was recalculating their flight plan, his expression tense. Captain, we've missed our slot. Operations says we're looking at approximately 40 minutes before we can get a new clearance. Marcus nodded, his expression betraying nothing of the gravity of what had just transpired. Understood. Let's complete our pre-flight checklist again and notify the passengers of the updated departure time. Hernandez hesitated, then said what was clearly on his mind. Sir, with respect, do you realize what you just did Alexandra Harrington's husband is? I know exactly who her husband is. Miguel, Marcus interrupted calmly, though his knuckles whitened slightly as he adjusted the controls. Howard Harrington, CEO of Harrington Financial Group, major investor in Atlantic Global, billionaire, influential board connections. None of that changes what happened or my responsibility as captain of this aircraft. But sir, you could lose your job over this, Hernandez persisted, genuine concern in his voice. 32 years with the airline, 3 years from retirement. Some things matter more than a job. Miguel, Marcus replied, focusing on the instruments. Now let's concentrate on getting these people to London safely. Back in the cabin, Carmen stopped by row 10 where Dr. Williams was comforting Zoe, who had finally stopped crying but still clutched Rex tightly. Dr. Williams, is there anything I can get for you or your daughter? Carmen asked gently. Nathan looked up, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude and lingering tension. Thank you, but we're fine. Please thank the captain for us. Would your daughter like to visit the cockpit before we take off? Sometimes that helps children feel better about flying, Carmen offered with a warm smile toward Zoe. Zoe's eyes widened slightly, the first positive reaction since the incident began. She looked up at her father questioningly, a small spark of wonder breaking through her distress. That's very kind, Nathan said. Zoe, would you like to see where the pilots sit? Zoe nodded, still clutching Rex but clearly intrigued by the offer. As Carmen led them toward the cockpit, Olivia Jackson caught Nathan's eye from across the aisle and gave him a subtle nod of solidarity. Her phone was still in her hand, but she was now typing rapidly, her journalistic instincts fully engaged. The story was already taking shape in her mind. Airline captain stands up to billionaire's wife in defense of passengers' dignity. Inside the cockpit, Marcus was surprised by the knock at the door, but immediately recognized Carmen on the security camera. He unlocked the door to find her standing with Dr. Williams and Zoe. Captain, Dr. Williams and his daughter Zoe would like to see the cockpit, if that's permitted. Carmen explained. Marcus's serious expression softened as he saw the little girl clutching her dinosaur. Absolutely, come in, Zoe. And who's your friend there? This is Rex, Zoe said quietly, her voice still slightly shaky. He's nervous about flying. Marcus smiled, genuinely this time. Well, Rex should know that this is one of the safest planes ever built. Would he like to see the controls? As Zoe stepped forward, captivated by the array of instruments and displays, Nathan extended his hand to Marcus. Thank you, Captain. What you did back there. He trailed off, searching for adequate words. Just doing my job. Dr. Williams, Marcus replied, accepting the handshake. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity on my aircraft. Outside in the terminal, Alexandra Harrington was already on her phone, her voice echoing through the boarding area as she paced furiously. Howard, you need to call the CEO right now. Do you understand me right now? That black pilot just humiliated me in front of an entire plane full of people. Her volume ensured that every word was clearly audible to the dozens of waiting passengers, many of whom were already recording her continued tirade. A group of teenagers huddled together, barely containing their laughter as they captured video for their social accounts. This is going viral faster than that crying Kardashian meme, one whispered to another. She's giving major main character energy right now, her friend replied. TikTok is going to feast on this. At 10:40 p.m. CT, Flight 892 finally pushed back from the gate, 47 minutes behind schedule. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, passengers throughout the cabin were already sharing videos of the incident across social media platforms. The hashtag Flight from Hell was gaining traction, soon to be joined by hashtag Captain Integrity as the footage spread. What had begun as a minor juice spill had escalated into something far more significant, a moment when power and privilege collided with dignity and principle in at 30,000 feet. And unknown to everyone on board, the consequences of that collision were just beginning to unfold. Airborne fallout 6 hours into the 8-hour flight to London, most passengers had settled into the rhythm of international travel. The cabin lights were dimmed, creating a cocoon of artificial night as Flight 892 cruised at 38,000 feet over the Atlantic. Many were sleeping. Some watched movies on their screens. Others worked quietly on laptops. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was subdued. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Hernandez had maintained a professional relationship throughout the flight, but the easy camaraderie of their earlier interactions had evaporated. They spoke only when necessary, focusing on flight parameters, weather updates, and approaching waypoints. The cockpit felt unusually small, as if the tension between them had taken up physical space. The cabin phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Marcus answered promptly. "Captain Reynolds?" came the voice of Timothy Davis, Atlantic Global's Vice President of Operations, patched through via satellite communications. "We need to discuss the incident prior to your departure from O'Hare." Marcus had been expecting this call. "Yes, sir, I'm available now." "Captain, I've received a direct call from Howard Harrington regarding his wife's removal from your aircraft. He's demanding immediate action." "I understand, sir," Marcus replied evenly, though his grip on the phone tightened slightly. "The company has decided to place you on administrative leave pending a full review of the incident, effective upon landing at Heathrow. A replacement captain will take command of the aircraft for the return flight." Marcus absorbed this information without visible reaction, though his stomach tightened into a hard knot. "Understood. This is a sensitive situation, Captain. Mr. Harrington is not just a passenger's spouse. Harrington Financial Group represents over $200 million in current investment in Atlantic Global, with another $300 million being negotiated. I'm aware of the relationship, sir." The cold reality of what was happening settled into Marcus's bones. "Then you understand the gravity of your actions," Davis continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from prepared talking points. "The company wants to assure you that this is standard procedure for any incident involving a high-profile customer. It's not a judgment on your decision-making." But they both knew that was exactly what it was. "I'll cooperate fully with the review, sir," Marcus said, his voice betraying none of the anger and disappointment coursing through him. "Will there be anything else?" "Yes. We've prepared a statement for you to sign upon landing, acknowledging that you could have handled the situation differently. Our legal team believes this will help diffuse the situation." Marcus paused for a long moment, during which only the steady hum of the aircraft engines could be heard. "With respect, sir, I'll need to review that statement before agreeing to sign anything." The line went silent for several beats. "Captain Reynolds, I strongly advise you to consider your position carefully. Your cooperation now could determine the outcome of this review." The subtext was clear: play ball or face termination. "I understand, sir. I'll give it my full consideration upon landing." After ending the call, Marcus sat motionless, processing the implications. Beside him, First Officer Hernandez had clearly overheard enough to understand what was happening. The younger pilot shifted uncomfortably in his seat, guilt evident in his posture. "Captain," Miguel began, his tone apologetic. "It's fine, Miguel." Marcus cut him off gently. "Let's focus on getting our passengers to London safely." Meanwhile, in premium economy, Olivia Jackson was unable to sleep. The cabin air felt dry against her face as she reviewed her notes in the dim blue light of her laptop. As a financial journalist who had covered Harrington Financial Group extensively, she recognized the significance of what she had witnessed. While most passengers had been focused on Alexandra Harrington's outrageous behavior, Olivia's trained eye had caught the subtext: the power dynamics, the implicit threats, the vulnerability of a captain doing the right thing against formidable corporate and financial pressure. She quietly unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way to where Dr. Williams sat awake, watching over his sleeping otter. Zoe had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled up with Rex tucked under her arm, her face peaceful in sleep. "Dr. Williams," she said softly, introducing herself. "I'm Olivia Jackson from the Wall Street Journal. May I speak with you briefly?" Nathan looked up, surprised. "The Wall Street Journal. I cover financial news, specifically investment banking," Olivia explained, sliding into the empty aisle seat next to him. "But what happened today goes beyond a simple passenger incident." "How so?" Nathan asked, curious despite his exhaustion. "Harrington Financial Group isn't just any company," Olivia explained in hushed tones. "They're a $17 billion investment firm with tentacles throughout the transportation industry. Howard Harrington sits on the boards of two airlines and has significant holdings in 3 others, including Atlantic Global." Nathan's expression showed dawning comprehension. "And that makes Captain Reynolds' decision even more significant." "Exactly. Olivia nodded. Harrington has a history of using his financial leverage to influence corporate decisions, including personnel matters. His firm has been named in at least 7 discrimination lawsuits that were quietly settled in the past decade. How do you know all this? I've been investigating them for an upcoming piece on diversity issues in financial services, Olivia admitted, her voice dropping even lower. What happened today fits a pattern. Their conversation was interrupted as Carmen passed by with the beverage cart, offering water to passengers who were awake. The ice cubes clinked softly in the plastic cups, a mundane sound that seemed oddly comforting amid the tension. Once she had moved on, Olivia continued, Captain Reynolds likely knew exactly what he was risking by standing up to Alexandra Harrington. In my experience, this kind of corporate pressure usually results in the employee being sacrificed to appease the powerful investor. Nathan frowned, glancing at his sleeping daughter. So you're saying the captain might lose his job because he defended us? It's very possible, Olivia confirmed, her expression grim. Unless there's enough public pressure to make that politically impossible for Atlantic Global. As they spoke, the videos from the confrontation were spreading rapidly across social media platforms. Despite the aircraft's limited Wi-Fi, some content had already been uploaded by passengers before takeoff or shared by those in the terminal who had witnessed Alexandra's continued tirade after deplaning. By 1:27 a.m. CT, midway over the Atlantic, the hashtags Captain Integrity and Harrington Exposed were trending in multiple countries. The story was beginning to jump from social media to mainstream news outlets, with morning shows in the U.S. already booking aviation experts to discuss the incident. A TikTok video showing Alexandra's removal had reached 1.3 million views with the caption, Karen gets removed after attacking black family on flight, #airplane Karens, #Captain Integrity why. The top comment with 47.8K likes read, the way the captain didn't even hesitate to choose what's right over what's easy, why. In premium economy, a remarkable thing was happening. Passengers were quietly organizing, passing a handwritten petition from row to row. We, the undersigned passengers of Atlantic Global Flight 892, witnessed Captain Marcus Reynolds' professional handling of a discriminatory incident on our flight. We commend his actions in defense of the dignity of all passengers and support him fully. The paper itself showed the impromptu nature of the effort, a page torn from a business traveler's notebook, slightly crumpled from being passed from hand to hand in the darkened cabin. By the time the petition reached Nathan Williams in row 10, it already contained over 40 signatures. Without hesitation, he added his own name to the growing list. The timestamp was 1:27 a.m. CT, as Flight 892 continued its journey toward London, oblivious to the digital storm gathering in its wake. Beneath the aircraft, the vast Atlantic churned in darkness. Within it, tensions simmered as a captain faced the possible end of his career. A father contemplated the lesson his daughter had witnessed, and a journalist recognized the story that could expose the intersection of corporate power and personal courage at 38,000 feet. Corporate panic in the executive conference room at Atlantic Global Airlines Chicago headquarters. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Despite the late hour, 11:30 p.m. CT, the room was filled with senior leadership, hastily assembled after multiple calls from Howard Harrington had reached CEO Daniel Foster's private line. The scent of expensive cologne mingled with coffee as executives huddled over their devices, monitoring the rapidly unfolding social media crisis. The wood-paneled room with its views of the Chicago skyline had witnessed countless corporate crises, but none quite like this. Patricia Morgan, VP of Operations and a 20-year veteran of the airline, stood at the head of the table reviewing security footage from Flight 892. At 50, with her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed a night of escalating emergency. The videos are already spreading, announced James Wilson, the airline's PR director, his attention split between 3 different devices monitoring social media. At 40, Wilson represented the newer generation of executives, as comfortable with viral metrics as with traditional press releases. We've identified 7 different passenger recordings so far, all showing slightly different angles of the same incident. How bad is it? Asked Foster, the 58-year-old CEO who had been pulled from a charity gala, still wearing his tuxedo with the bow tie now undone. The remains of a $1,000 per plate dinner sat forgotten in his stomach as he took another antacid. Bad and getting worse, Wilson replied grimly, swiping through screenshots on his tablet. Alexandra Harrington comes across as problematic. The racial undertones are unmistakable, and Captain Reynolds appears composed and professional throughout. The public is already rallying behind him. Wilson turned his tablet to display the metrics. The main TikTok video has 2.7 million views and climbing. Twitter is on fire with hashtag Captain Integrity trending in 8 countries. We've got a major civil rights organizations making statements about watching this situation closely. Shit, Foster muttered. Just shit. Patricia paused the security footage at a particularly damning moment, Alexandra Harrington pointing at Dr. Williams with the words, "Move them to the back where they belong," clearly audible. From an operational standpoint, Captain Reynolds followed our dignity and respect guidelines to the letter. He gave Ms. Harrington clear options and maintained decorum throughout. That's not the point, interjected Marshall Jenkins, Atlantic Global's chief legal counsel. At 62, Jenkins had navigated the airline through countless crises, always prioritizing financial and legal protection over public sentiment. He pounded his fist on the polished table, making water glasses jump. The point is that Howard Harrington is threatening to pull $200 million in current investment and block the additional $300 million we're counting on for the Asian expansion. The room fell silent as the financial implications sank in. Foster rubbed his temples, smudging his glasses in the process. Options. We've already placed Reynolds on administrative leave pending review. Patricia reported. Standard procedure for any high-profile customer incident. Not enough, Jenkins shook his head, his jowls quivering slightly with agitation. Harrington wants him terminated immediately. He was explicit about that. On what grounds? Patricia challenged, her voice rising. I've reviewed the footage multiple times. Reynolds acted within policy guidelines for discriminatory incidents. We can find grounds, Jenkins replied coldly, not meeting her eyes. Deviation from procedure? Unnecessary delay causing financial impact? Something in his record we can magnify. James Wilson looked up from his devices, alarmed. If we fire him without clear cause, especially with these videos circulating, the PR damage would be catastrophic. We're already seeing support for the captain building across platforms. Look at this. He displayed a Reddit thread with over 14,000 upvotes titled, "Captain Stands Up to Billionaire's Racist Wife. Risked career to defend 8-year-old black girl." The Harrington account is worth more than some temporary PR damage, Jenkins countered, his tone dismissive. Is it worth more than our entire diversity and inclusion initiative? Patricia asked pointedly, her voice cutting through the corporate doublespeak. Because that's what we'd be undermining. We've spent $47 million over 3 years building a more inclusive corporate culture. And now we're considering firing a black captain for standing up to racist behavior because the perpetrator's husband is rich. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Executives avoided eye contact, the hypocrisy of the situation hanging in the air like stale cigarette smoke. What about a middle ground, suggested Wilson, clearly trying to broker compromise. Administrative leave transitions to early retirement with a non-disclosure agreement. Reynolds gets his pension. We avoid wrongful termination claims, and Harrington sees that action was taken. Foster nodded slowly, brightening at this possible solution. That might work. Reynolds is what? 3 years from retirement anyway. He shouldn't have to retire at all, Patricia insisted, her voice rising with barely contained anger. The man did his job with integrity. Integrity doesn't fund our fleet expansion, Jenkins retorted, his tone dripping with condescension. Actually, Wilson interrupted, his eyes on his tablet. This is evolving quickly. Hashtag Atlantic Global Racism is now trending. We've got major civil rights organizations making statements about watching this situation closely. He turned the screen to display a tweet from a prominent civil rights attorney, watching Atlantic Global closely. Will they stand with their captain, who upheld their own anti-discrimination policy, or cave to billionaire pressure? Lawsuit potential either way. But only one path has integrity. Hashtag Captain Integrity. Foster's expression darkened as he read the post. Harrington made it clear this isn't negotiable. He wants Reynolds gone, or he pulls his funding and launches a hostile one takeover. His exact words were, I've crushed people far more important than some self-righteous pilot. He's done it before, Jenkins added, his voice lowered as if sharing confidential intelligence. Remember Westfield Airlines last year? Their CEO refused Harrington's board seat request, and within 6 months, Harrington had acquired enough shares to force a boardroom coup. Their entire executive team was replaced. Patricia looked disgusted, her lips pressing into a thin line. So we sacrifice a dedicated employee with an unblemished record to protect ourselves from a billionaire bully. We protect thousands of other employees and shareholders from financial catastrophe, Jenkins corrected, straightening his tie with manicured fingers. This is business, not a morality play. James Wilson cleared his throat. There's something else to consider. Flight 892 included 23 business journalists returning from the International Finance Forum, including Olivia Jackson from the Wall Street Journal, who specializes in investment banking, Foster finished, his face paling slightly. And she witnessed everything. Wilson nodded grimly. She's already posted cryptically about a revealing incident demonstrating power dynamics in corporate America and tagged Harrington Financial Group. The room fell silent as the executives considered the compounding complications. The situation was evolving from a customer service incident into a potential corporate governance crisis with media scrutiny, public opinion, and financial pressure all converging at once. Here's what we do, Foster finally decided, his authoritative tone attempting to mask his uncertainty. Reynolds stays on administrative leave for now. We issue a neutral statement about investigating the incident thoroughly. Wilson, prepare separate statements for different outcomes, depending on how the public narrative develops overnight. And if Harrington escalates his threats, Jenkins asked, his expression skeptical. Foster's expression hardened, though a muscle in his jaw twitched nervously. Then we'll have a difficult decision to make. But let's not fire a man for doing the right thing until we've exhausted all alternatives. As the meeting disbanded, Patricia lingered, reviewing the security footage one more time. The image of Captain Reynolds standing firm against Alexandra Harrington's threats contrasted sharply with this roomful of executives equivocating in the face of her husband's financial leverage. On her way out, she paused beside Foster. Just so you know, Daniel, if you terminate Reynolds for this, I'll resign in protest. And I won't go quietly. The CEO stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The timestamp read 11:30 p.m. CT. In a corporate headquarters designed to project power and confidence, a group of leaders found themselves uncomfortably confronting the price of integrity in an industry where profit margins were thin and investor confidence was everything. The question hanging over them was stark in its simplicity. What was the right thing worth? Measured in dollars and cents, Harrington's response. In his Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park, Howard Harrington was incandescent with rage. At 65, with a frame still powerful despite his age and steel-gray hair that contributed to his intimidating presence, Harrington had built a financial empire through a combination of brilliant investment strategy and ruthless elimination of obstacles. The $42 million living room, with its museum-quality art and custom furnishings, vibrated with his fury. What do you mean? It's already online, he demanded, glaring at his chief of staff, Andrew Peterson, who had been unfortunate enough to deliver the news about the videos circulating on social media. Multiple passengers recorded the incident. Sir, Peterson explained, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension vibrating through the luxurious apartment. He kept his posture perfectly straight, having learned that any sign of weakness only invited more aggression. The videos are spreading rapidly across platforms. Current view count exceeds 700,000 and growing. Take them down, Harrington ordered flatly, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that his staff had learned to fear more than his shouting. Copyright claims, privacy violations, whatever it takes. That's problematic. Sir, the videos were recorded in a public space and there are multiple sources. Traditional takedown methods won't be effective in this case. Harrington slammed his hand down on his marble countertop, causing his crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 to jump slightly. The amber liquid sloshed against the crystal, catching the recessed lighting from above. I don't pay you to tell me what can't be done. Andrew, I pay you to make problems disappear. Yes, sir. The crisis team is already working on containment strategies. Harrington paced the expansive living room, the lights of Manhattan glittering beyond floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most Americans' annual salary. His Italian leather shoes made no sound on the plush carpet, a small detail that somehow made his anger more menacing. His wife Alexandra was in the master bathroom, having taken a sedative after her hysterical call from the airport. "Get me Daniel Foster on the phone, now." Peterson hesitated, glancing at his watch. "Sir, it's after midnight. Perhaps a more measured approach in the morning would—" "Now, Andrew." The two syllables carried the weight of countless careers destroyed for lesser offenses. As Peterson stepped away to place the call, Harrington reviewed what his wife had told him before her medication took effect. The details inflamed his sense of entitlement. A black pilot had humiliated Alexandra in front of an entire aircraft, taking the side of some economy passengers over his wife, forcing her to deplane like a common criminal. The symbolism wasn't lost on Howard. Throughout his career, he had systematically eliminated challenges to his authority, whether they came from competitors, regulators, or his own employees. This pilot, Reynolds, had directly challenged the Harrington name, and by extension, Howard's carefully constructed power structure. "Mr. Foster is on the line, sir," Peterson announced, returning with a phone. "Daniel," Howard began without preamble, his voice deceptively calm. "I understand you have a problem pilot who needs to be grounded permanently." The conversation that followed was brief and one-sided. Howard laid out his expectations in precise terms. Captain Marcus Reynolds was to be terminated immediately, not just placed on administrative leave. A public statement would attribute the dismissal to violation of company procedures, resulting in unnecessary delays and customer dissatisfaction. The incident with Alexandra would be characterized as a misunderstanding that Reynolds had mishandled due to poor judgment. "I don't think you understand the severity of the situation, Daniel," Harrington continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "My firm currently holds $200 million in Atlantic Global stock and convertible bonds. The additional $300 million we've discussed for your Asian expansion is now contingent on how you handle this situation." He paused, letting the financial reality sink in. "Furthermore, should you choose to support this pilot's insubordination, I'm prepared to increase our position in Atlantic Global and initiate a shareholder action to replace board members who fail to protect the company's relationship with its most significant investors." The threat was clear: fire Reynolds or face a hostile takeover. After ending the call, Harrington turned to Peterson. "Activate the full crisis team. I want opposition research on Reynolds, everything from his performance reviews to his personal finances. Find leverage." "Yes, sir." "Anything else?" Peterson's tablet was already filling with notes, his fingers flying across the screen. "Contact our media partners. I want stories ready by morning about airline protocols being violated, flights unnecessarily delayed, and the real costs of performative wokeness in the transportation industry." Peterson nodded, making notes on his tablet. "And find out everything about the passengers involved, especially the ones recording. I want to know if they're connected to any activist groups, or if this was a setup." His paranoia was showing now. The default assumption that any challenge must be part of a conspiracy rather than a legitimate response to inappropriate behavior. As Peterson left to execute these directives, Harrington poured himself another 3 fingers of scotch and walked to the window. The city below was a glittering chessboard where he had long been the grandmaster, moving pieces according to his will, eliminating threats with calculating precision. He sipped the expensive liquor, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. A fleeting image of his father crossed his mind, a strict, demanding man who had repeatedly told him that respect had to be taken, never earned. That wealth was the only true protection against a world that would always try to tear you down if you showed any weakness. Throughout his career, Howard had faced challenges to his authority and had systematically crushed each one. The environmental activist who had protested a Harrington development project now worked as a janitor after legal fees had bankrupted him. The financial journalist who had questioned Harrington's trading practices had been blacklisted from reputable publications after a fabricated scandal. The former partner who had raised ethical concerns now lived in obscurity, his reputation shattered by strategic leaks and planted stories. Captain Marcus Reynolds was simply the next name on a long list of people who had dared to stand against Harrington interests. By tomorrow evening, if history was any indicator, He would be updating his resume and explaining to his family why his 3-decade career had suddenly imploded. The timestamp was 12:15 a.m. CT as Howard Harrington sipped his scotch, confident in the machinery of influence and retribution he had spent decades perfecting. What he couldn't see from his penthouse perch was that this particular adversary had something his previous victims lacked: the unfiltered truth of his actions captured from multiple angles and already spreading beyond his ability to contain it. For perhaps the first time in his carefully controlled career, Howard Harrington had encountered a situation he couldn't simply buy his way out of, though he would spend millions trying. London arrival flight 892, touchdown at London Heathrow at 11:23 a.m. local time. The Boeing 787's wheels meeting British tarmac with a gentle chirp, despite the turbulence they had encountered over the Irish Sea. Captain Reynolds completed the landing with the same precision and professionalism he had demonstrated throughout his career, giving no indication of the professional uncertainty that awaited him. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow Airport," he announced over the intercom, his deep voice steady. "Local time is 11:23 a.m., and the temperature is 14 degrees Celsius. On behalf of Atlantic Global Airlines and our entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today." What he didn't mention was the unusual sight that had greeted him during their approach: 3 news vans with satellite uplinks positioned near the international terminal, their logos clearly visible even from the air. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, First Officer Hernandez broke the professional silence that had characterized much of their flight. "Captain, I want you to know I respect what you did back in Chicago. I should have supported you more directly." His voice carried a mixture of admiration and regret that made the admission more meaningful. "When you left the cockpit, I was thinking about quarterly bonuses and schedules. You were thinking about people." Marcus nodded, appreciating the gesture but recognizing its limitations. "Thank you. Miguel, I understand your position." The cockpit phone buzzed. Marcus answered to find Atlantic Global's London station manager on the line, her tone clipped informal. "Captain Reynolds, upon deplaning, please proceed directly to the operations office. Do not speak with any media representatives who may approach you. I repeat, do not engage with media under any circumstances." "Understood," Marcus replied, the final confirmation of what he had suspected since the mid-flight call from headquarters. This wasn't going to blow over. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the familiar sounds of passengers preparing to deplane filled the cabin. The click of seatbelts, the rustle of belongings being gathered, the thud of overhead bins opening and closing. As passengers began to deplane, something unexpected happened. It started with a single passenger in first class, an elderly British gentleman who paused beside the cockpit door, made eye contact with Marcus, and said simply, "Well done, Captain. Proper command decision." Then another passenger stopped, offering a nod of respect, and another, and another. By the time Drs. Williams and Zoe reached the front of the aircraft, a small crowd had gathered, creating a bottleneck as passengers expressed their support to the captain. Nathan approached with Zoe, who now clutched not only Rex but also a drawing she had made during the flight. "Captain Reynolds," Nathan began, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to thank you properly for what you did. You stood up for my daughter's dignity when you had every professional incentive to look the other way." Zoe stepped forward, slightly shy but determined, and handed Marcus her drawing. It showed a pilot standing tall while a smaller figure, clearly Zoe with Rex, stood behind him facing a large, angry-looking woman. Above the scene, in a child's careful printing, were the words, "Thank you for helping me and Rex." "You're a hero," she said simply, the words carrying the pure conviction that only children can muster. Marcus accepted the drawing with genuine emotion breaking through his professional composure. "Thank you, Zoe. Rex too. You both were very brave." Carmen Diaz approached, having overheard the exchange. "Captain, the passengers have organized something." She handed him the sheets of paper that had circulated through the cabin during the flight. "A petition supporting you, signed by 213 passengers." Marcus was momentarily speechless as he scanned the pages of signatures, each representing a witness to his stand against discrimination. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message from Atlantic Global's HR department. "Upon arrival, proceed to operations office. Bring no recording devices. Legal representative will be present. Confidential matter." AG, Human Resources. The reality of his situation crashed back like a physical weight. Despite the passenger support, despite being in the right, the machinery of corporate damage control was already in motion. Outside the aircraft, the scene was even more surprising. As passengers emerged into the terminal, they found journalists waiting, asking questions about the incident on Flight 892. The story had somehow leaped ahead of them across the Atlantic. The videos are already at 4 million views combined, one reporter explained. It's the top trending topic on Twitter and TikTok right now. Olivia Jackson was immediately approached by colleagues from British news outlets, who recognized the Wall Street Journal reporter. Ms. Jackson, you witnessed the incident. Can you confirm reports that Alexandra Harrington used racial language toward another passenger before being removed from the aircraft? Is it true that Howard Harrington has threatened the airline financially if they don't terminate Captain Reynolds? Camera lights created harsh shadows across tired faces as passengers emerged into the terminal. Olivia handled the questions with journalistic precision, neither confirming nor denying details she couldn't verify. But her presence alone lent credibility to the story's growing prominence. Meanwhile, Dr. Williams and Zoe found themselves similarly surrounded, though airport security quickly established a protective perimeter around them, particularly when they realized Zoe's distress at the sudden attention. Dr. Williams, how do you feel about Captain Reynolds potentially losing his job for defending you and your daughter? Nathan paused, considering his response carefully. With Zoe holding his hand tightly, he addressed the cameras directly. Captain Reynolds did what every person in authority should do when witnessing discrimination. He didn't look away. He didn't prioritize convenience or schedule or status. He prioritized human dignity. If there are consequences for that kind of moral clarity, then we need to ask serious questions about our corporate values. His measured response, delivered with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the incident, would feature prominently in news coverage throughout the day. Back at the aircraft, Marcus finally deplaned, flanked by 2 airline representatives who escorted him briskly through a side entrance, avoiding the media presence. Their grip on his arms was just firm enough to suggest that this wasn't optional. In the sterile environment of the operations office, he found Patricia Morgan waiting, having flown to London on the carrier's earlier flight specifically to handle the situation. Marcus, she began, her expression grave. I'm going to be direct. The company has decided to place you on formal suspension without pay, pending investigation. Despite having anticipated this, the reality still landed hard. On what grounds? Patricia, she couldn't quite meet his eyes. Violation of company procedures resulting in unnecessary delay and customer dissatisfaction. That's corporate speak for Harrington made a phone call, isn't it? Patricia didn't deny it. The situation is complicated. There are financial considerations that extend beyond a single flight. So my career of 32 years comes down to whether a billionaire's wife was inconvenienced for standing on the wrong side of basic human respect. It's not that simple. Actually, Patricia, it is exactly that simple. Marcus interrupted, his calm dignity never wavering. And we both know it. As Marcus left the operations office with his suspension papers in hand, he checked his phone to find 47 missed calls, 213 text messages, and thousands of notifications across his social media accounts. The incident had exploded online, with his name and image spreading far beyond aviation circles. The most recent notification was from CNN. Captain suspended after removing billionaire's wife from flight for racial comments. Exclusive interview with passengers tonight. Marcus sighed heavily, realizing that what had begun as a simple matter of principle had now thrust him into a spotlight he never sought. He had stood up for what was right, and it had likely cost him his career. As he headed alone to his hotel room, uncertain about his future for the first time in decades, he wondered if he would make the same choice again. The answer came to him immediately, without hesitation. Oh yes, some prices were worth paying. The timestamp was 11:23 a.m. London time, and while Captain Marcus Reynolds faced the professional consequences of his integrity, the public narrative was just beginning to take shape, a narrative that would eventually reach far beyond one flight, one airline, or even one industry. Part 3, the battle escalates Reynolds' personal crisis. In his London hotel room, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, television remote in hand, as his own face stared back at him from BBC News. The chyron beneath his official Atlantic Global portrait read, "Airline captain suspended after confronting billionaire's wife over alleged racist comments." "This is surreal," he muttered to himself, watching as aviation experts debated the protocols for removing passengers and the captain's authority in such situations. The unfamiliar hotel room felt sterile and impersonal. Beige walls, generic artwork, the faint smell of industrial cleaning products that couldn't quite mask the traces of thousands of previous occupants. His phone rang. Diana, his wife, calling for the third time since he had texted her about his suspension. This time he answered. "Hey," he said simply, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline of the past 24 hours began to fade. "Marcus," Diana's voice came through, steady and supportive despite the worry evident in her tone. "Marcus, I've been watching the news. Are you okay?" "I'm suspended without pay, effective immediately," he replied, rubbing his forehead where a tension headache was forming. "They're calling it a violation of company procedures, but we both know what it really is." "Harrington," Diana said, not a question, but a statement. Patricia all but confirmed it. The billionaire made a call, and suddenly my 3 decades of service mean nothing. He couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "You're all over social media. Amara called, and then she says you're trending on 3 platforms. People are calling you #Captain Integrity." "Great. Maybe I can pay our mortgage with hashtags." The silence between them was heavy with shared understanding. They had been married for 27 years, had weathered financial challenges before, had put their daughter through medical school on their combined salaries as airline captain and high school principal. They knew exactly what this suspension meant. "We have savings," Diana finally said. "Not much, but enough to get by for a while if we're careful." Marcus closed his eyes, calculations running through his mind. 3 years until my planned retirement. If they terminate me, I'll lose at least 30% of my pension. That's almost $400,000 over our lifetime. He glanced around the anonymous hotel room, suddenly feeling every one of his 52 years. The comfortable retirement they had carefully planned, the small lake house they had their eye on, the travel they had postponed while raising Amara, seemed to recede like a mirage. "Can they really fire you for this? The videos I've seen clearly show you were in the right." "Being right doesn't always matter in corporate America, Diana. Not when you're up against someone worth billions who can threaten the entire airline's financing." He glanced back at the television, where they were now showing clips from passenger videos of the incident. The footage was even more damning than he had realized. Alexandra Harrington's condescension and thinly veiled racism captured from multiple angles, contrasted with his own calm professionalism. "The public is on your side," Diana offered. "That has to count for something." "Public support doesn't pay the mortgage," Marcus replied, more bitterly than he had intended. "Sorry, I'm just processing what this means for us, for Amara's med school loans." Amara called. "By the way, she's seen the videos too." "Yeah, so," she said, and I quote, "Tell Dad he did exactly what he taught me to do. Stand up for what's right, regardless of the consequences." A lump formed in Marcus's throat. "Great. So I've successfully taught our daughter to prioritize principles over financial security. Isn't that exactly what you've always believed?" Diana challenged gently. "Marcus, in 27 years, I've never known you to take the easy path when the right path was clear. It's why I fell in love with you. It's why you're respected by everyone who really knows you." The simple truth in her words cut through his self-pity. Diana had always been his moral compass, not because she pushed him toward righteousness, but because she recognized it as his natural state. "I know you're right," he admitted. "It's just harder when it's not just me bearing the consequences. We're a team, Marcus. Always have been. If standing up for what's right costs us financially, we'll figure it out. We always do." Marcus sighed, looking out the window at the London skyline. The right path just got a lot more expensive than I anticipated. His phone pinged with an incoming message, a news alert from the Wall Street Journal. Harrington Financial Group leveraging $200 million investment to pressure Atlantic Global on personnel decisions. Sources say, "Looks like Olivia Jackson is breaking the financial angle," he told Diana. "Harrington's using his investment as leverage to get me fired." Then we fight, Diana said simply. If they're going to terminate you for doing the right thing, make them do it publicly. Make them own it. Marcus considered this, the trained caution of his decades as a pilot warring with his growing indignation. Fighting a billionaire rarely ends well for the little guy. You're not just any little guy, Marcus. You're Captain Marcus Reynolds, with 32 years of exemplary service and 213 passenger signatures supporting your actions. Plus, you have one thing Harrington doesn't. What's that? The unvarnished truth, captured on video from multiple angles. As they continued talking, Marcus's email pinged with a message from Atlantic Global's HR department, detailing the investigation process and reiterating that he was forbidden from speaking to the media during this period. The language was coldly formal, as if they were discussing a stranger rather than someone who had given the company 3 decades of loyal service. After ending the call with Diana, Marcus stood at the window, watching planes take off and land at Heathrow with the precise, ordered rhythm that had defined his professional life. The familiar sight that had always brought him comfort now felt like watching a world he was being expelled from. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure when or if he would command an aircraft again. His hotel phone rang, the front desk informing him that several reporters were in the lobby asking for him. The isolated bubble of the cockpit, where his authority had been absolute and his judgment rarely questioned, had been replaced by a maelstrom of media attention and corporate politics for which his training had never prepared him. On the television, a financial analyst was now discussing the implications. Harrington Financial Group has significant leverage here. Their $200 million position in Atlantic Global represents approximately 7% of the airline's total market capitalization. And the additional $300 million they've been discussing for Asian expansion routes is critical to the carrier's 5-year growth strategy. The message was clear in a battle between a captain's principles and a billionaire's ego. The smart money was betting on the billionaire. The timestamp was 2:17 p.m. London time. In a hotel room far from home, Captain Marcus Reynolds confronted a reality that countless others had faced before him: the steep personal cost of professional integrity when it challenged power and privilege. What he couldn't yet see was that this particular confrontation was rapidly evolving beyond a simple career setback into something far more significant for everyone involved. Harrington's counterattack. Howard Harrington's corner office on the 57th floor of Harrington Tower offered a panoramic view of Manhattan that reinforced his sense of control over his domain. At 9:00 a.m. ET, he was already on his 5th call of the morning, this one with Lawrence Mitchell, editor-in-chief of Aviation Business Daily, a trade publication heavily dependent on advertising from companies in which Harrington Financial Group held significant positions. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space that had been meticulously designed to intimidate visitors. The massive Brazilian hardwood desk positioned to make anyone sitting across from it feel small. The wall of awards and honors carefully arranged to establish credentials. The original Picasso strategically placed to signal wealth beyond the comprehension of most who entered. "Lawrence, I'm concerned about the narrative developing around this incident," Harrington said smoothly, his voice betraying none of the rage that had consumed him the previous night. "We both know that airline protocols exist for a reason. This captain, Reynolds, created unnecessary delays affecting hundreds of passengers because of what was essentially a minor customer service issue." On the other end of the line, Mitchell understood exactly what was being asked of him. The unspoken transaction was familiar: favorable coverage in exchange for continued advertising revenue. The publisher's quarterly numbers were due next week, and Harrington-connected companies represented nearly 30% of their ad budget. "Of course, Howard, we're working on a piece examining the financial impact of departure delays and the chain reactions they cause throughout the system." "Excellent. I believe there's also a deeper story about how social media pressures are forcing transportation professionals to make performative decisions rather than operational ones." "That's an interesting angle, though, Mama." Mitchell agreed, the subtext clear. "We could explore whether Atlantic Global's diversity initiatives might be creating conflicting priorities for their staff." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Harrington subtly shaping the narrative without ever explicitly asking for a hit piece on Reynolds. By the time he hung up, the framework for a story questioning Reynolds' judgment and professionalism was firmly established. Similar calls had already been placed to financial reporters, industry analysts, and commentators who regularly appeared on business news programs. By mid-morning, the first articles began appearing online. Captain's decision to remove passenger costs airline $42,000 in operational expenses. Reynolds' record sources reveal previous incidents of confrontational leadership style. Aviation experts question protocol violation in Atlantic Global incident. Each piece carefully avoided mentioning the racial component of the original confrontation, instead framing it as a case study in operational inefficiency and the dangers of emotionally driven decision-making. In the conference room adjacent to his office, Harrington's crisis management team, consisting of PR specialists, social media strategists, and opposition researchers, worked to implement the multi-pronged strategy they had developed overnight. The room hummed with activity, multiple screens displaying social media metrics, news coverage, and detailed analyses of the public response. Jessica Winters, Harrington's head of digital communications, delivered an update. We've identified several pilots from competing airlines willing to go on record questioning Captain Reynolds' decision-making. We're arranging appearances on financial news programs throughout the day. She swiped through a presentation on her tablet, displaying metrics. Our counter-narrative is gaining traction in financial and aviation circles. Though the broader public sentiment still favors Reynolds, we're seeing some division emerging in the aviation community. What about Reynolds himself? Harrington asked, his manicured fingernails tapping impatiently on the polished table. What have you found? Robert Blackwell, the former private investigator who now led Harrington's research division, opened a folder. Marcus Reynolds, 52, 32 years with Atlantic Global, previously 12 years in the Air Force, married to Diana Reynolds, high school principal. One daughter, Amara, second-year medical student at Johns Hopkins. Weaknesses, Harrington pressed, leaning forward slightly. Financially stretched, the daughter's medical school is expensive, and they're carrying a substantial mortgage on a modest home in suburban Chicago. No significant savings beyond his airline 401k. 3 years from retirement eligibility. Perfect. Harrington smiled thinly. Satisfaction evident in his expression. A man with everything to lose. Make sure Atlantic Global understands that this information will be used publicly if they don't handle Reynolds appropriately. The implicit threat was clear. If the airline didn't terminate Reynolds, Harrington would ensure that his financial vulnerabilities became part of the public narrative. The strategy session continued, with Harrington personally approving talking points that would be distributed to friendly media contacts. This incident represents a concerning trend of operational decisions being influenced by social media pressure rather than established protocols. Captain Reynolds created an unnecessary delay affecting 247 passengers over what was essentially a minor customer service issue. Questions have emerged about Reynolds' history of confrontational leadership and whether this latest incident fits a pattern of behavior. On a sleek digital whiteboard, the team had mapped out a network of influencers, journalists, and commentators who could be leveraged to spread these narratives. Lines connected each name to Harrington-related entities, advertising relationships, board positions, investment connections that could be used as pressure points. By noon, the counter-narrative of Daikin was gaining traction in certain circles. Financial news programs featured aviation experts questioning whether Reynolds had overreacted, whether his decision had been influenced by factors other than operational concerns, and whether Atlantic Global's diversity initiatives had created a corporate culture where customer service took a back seat to political correctness. What Harrington hadn't anticipated was the sheer volume and emotional resonance of the passenger videos. For every skeptical financial analyst questioning Reynolds' judgment, there were thousands of social media users sharing clips of Alexandra Harrington's contemptuous treatment of Williams and Zoe. The raw footage of a powerful white woman demanding that a black father and child be moved to the back where they belong proved difficult to spin. Even for Harrington's experienced PR team, a 19-second TikTok clip showing Zoe's tearful face as Alexandra demanded her removal had reached 7.2 million views with the caption, "When the let me speak to your manager lady meets a captain who doesn't back down, #Captain Integrity, #Flight from Hell." At 2:30 p.m., Harrington received disturbing news from Jessica Winters. "Sir, we have a problem. Olivia Jackson's article just dropped in the Wall Street Journal. She's directly connecting your financial pressure on Atlantic Global to Reynolds' suspension." Harrington snatched the tablet, his face darkening as he read the headline, Billionaire Leverage, How Howard Harrington Uses Financial Muscle to Punish Airline a Captain Who Confronted His Wife. The article's opening paragraph was damning. When Captain Marcus Reynolds stood up for the dignity of a black family facing discriminatory treatment from Alexandra Harrington on Flight 892, he likely knew he was risking his career. What he couldn't have known was that within hours, her husband Howard Harrington would be on the phone with Atlantic Global's CEO, explicitly threatening to withdraw $200 million in investments if Reynolds wasn't terminated immediately. Harrington's face darkened as he scanned the piece on his tablet. Jackson had somehow obtained details of his conversation with Atlantic Global's CEO, including specific threats about the $200 million investment and the pending $300 million deal. Worse, she had connected these threats to a pattern of similar interventions at other companies in which Harrington Financial Group held significant positions. "Find out who leaked this," Harrington demanded, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "Someone at Atlantic Global is talking to Jackson. I want to know who, and I want them destroyed." He flung the tablet onto the conference table, where it skidded across the polished surface. "And get me Foster on the phone again. Tell him his window for handling this quietly is closing." By late afternoon, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Harrington's financial muscle and media connections had succeeded in creating questions about Reynolds' professionalism in business and aviation circles. But the broader public narrative remained firmly supportive of the captain who had stood up against discriminatory behavior. The situation reached a new level of visibility when civil rights organizations began issuing statements supporting Reynolds and calling for accountability from Atlantic Global and Harrington Financial Group. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, issued a particularly pointed statement. "The suspension of Captain Marcus Reynolds represents a troubling prioritization of financial relationships over basic human dignity. When corporations allow wealthy investors to punish employees for standing against discriminatory behavior, they send a devastating message about their values. We will be watching Atlantic Global's handling of this situation closely." In his office, Harrington's rage built as he watched his carefully constructed narrative being overwhelmed by the simple power of the unfiltered truth. He had successfully crushed opponents throughout his career, but those victories had always occurred in the shadowy world of corporate boardrooms and financial maneuvers. This battle was playing out in the full light of public scrutiny, with video evidence that even his considerable resources couldn't erase. "Get me Foster again," he snapped at his assistant. "Tell him I'm adjusting my timeline. If Reynolds isn't terminated by this time tomorrow, we begin increasing our position in Atlantic Global. I want a controlling interest in a new board by the end of the month." The timestamp was 9 o'clock MET on the day after Flight 892, and Howard Harrington had fully committed to destroying Captain Marcus Reynolds, regardless of the cost. What he failed to recognize was that, for perhaps the first time in his career, he was facing an adversary who couldn't be intimidated by financial threats, because Marcus Reynolds had already accepted the potential loss of everything he had worked for. In the high-stakes world of corporate power plays, Harrington had never encountered an opponent whose principles were genuinely non-negotiable. This unfamiliar territory would prove far more challenging than he anticipated. Unexpected ally, Olivia Jackson worked furiously in her temporary office at the Wall Street Journal's London bureau, surrounded by notebooks, financial reports, and printouts of SEC filings related to Harrington Financial Group. The smell of her third coffee of the day mingled with the musty scent of old newspapers stored in the adjacent archive room. Her laptop screen cast a blue glow across her concentrated face as rain tapped gently against the window, creating a soothing counterpoint to the tension in her shoulders. After her initial article connecting Howard Harrington's financial pressure to Reynolds' suspension, she was now digging deeper into a pattern that had emerged from her research. 7 discrimination lawsuits in 5 years, all settled confidentially, she muttered to herself, organizing the documents into color-coded folders. Post-it notes created a complex web of connections on the wall behind her desk. And those are just the ones that made it to court filings before being sealed. As a financial journalist who had covered Harrington Financial Group for nearly a decade, Olivia had accumulated substantial background knowledge about Howard Harrington's business practices. What had always been missing was the smoking gun, clear evidence of how he leveraged his financial power to silence critics and crush opposition. Until now, her phone rang. An encrypted call from a source she had cultivated at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Harrington settlements you asked about, the source began without preamble. They total approximately $47 million across the 7 cases, all with identical non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement clauses. Any pattern to the plaintiffs, Olivia asked, scribbling notes in her reporter's shorthand. All minorities, 5 Black, 2 Hispanic, all former employees who raised concerns about discriminatory practices within Harrington-controlled companies. This confirmed what Olivia had suspected. The incident with Alexandra Harrington on Flight 892 wasn't an isolated occurrence, but part of a pattern that extended throughout the Harrington business empire. What about the severance packages for executives who challenged Harrington's practices? Olivia pressed. Interesting pattern there, her source replied, and the sound of papers shuffling coming through the line. When executives who championed diversity initiatives were pushed out, their severance packages were consistently 30% below industry standard for comparable positions. Those who left for other reasons received standard or above standard packages. That's financial punishment for promoting inclusion, Olivia noted, connecting another dot in her investigation. After ending the call, Olivia turned her attention to the NDAs themselves. Through careful source development, she had obtained a template of the agreement Harrington typically used. The language was extraordinarily restrictive, preventing signatories from discussing not only the specific incidents that led to their complaints, but any aspect of Harrington's business practices they had observed during their employment. The penalties for violation were severe: full repayment of settlement amounts, plus punitive damages of up to 3 times the original settlement. For people who had been forced out of their industries by Harrington's influence, these financial threats effectively ensured their silence. As Olivia reviewed her notes, her office phone rang. The call was from an unexpected source, Rafael Mendez, a prominent civil rights attorney known for taking on powerful corporate interests. Ms. Jackson, Mendez began, his voice carrying the precise diction of someone accustomed to courtroom oratory. I've read your article about Captain Reynolds in Harrington Financial Group. I believe we might have mutual interest to discuss. I'm listening, Olivia replied cautiously, journalist instincts on alert. My firm has represented 3 former employees in settlements with Harrington-controlled companies. While I cannot discuss the specifics of those cases due to confidentiality agreements, I can tell you that I've been looking for a way to address a pattern of behavior that extends far beyond individual incidents. Olivia sat up straighter. What are you suggesting? Mr. Mendez, the Reynolds situation presents a unique opportunity. Unlike previous Harrington targets, Reynolds has substantial public support and, more importantly, unambiguous video evidence that Harrington cannot suppress. If properly handled, this case could create a precedent for how corporations respond to financial pressure from investors attempting to shield discriminatory behavior. Rain streaked down the office window, creating distorted patterns that seemed to mirror the complex web of connections Olivia was uncovering. You want to make Reynolds a test case, she surmised. Precisely, and your reporting on the financial leverage being applied behind the scenes is critical to establishing the pattern. Would you be willing to meet to discuss this further? I believe I could provide context that would be valuable to your reporting, even without violating my confidentiality obligations. Olivia agreed immediately, recognizing the potential breakthrough this represented. While Mendez couldn't discuss specific settlements, his expertise and understanding of the pattern could help connect dots that had previously remained separate in her reporting. They arranged to meet that evening at Mendez's hotel, where he was staying while in London for an international legal conference. The timing was serendipitous, having one of America's most respected civil rights attorneys in London precisely when the Reynolds story was breaking added another dimension to the developing narrative. After hanging up, Olivia received an email from her editor approving an expanded investigation into Harrington Financial Group's history of discrimination settlements. The subject line read, "Green light for full series, deadline extended." This was the professional opportunity Olivia had been working toward for years, a chance to expose how financial power was used to shield discriminatory practices at the highest levels of American business. Captain Reynolds' stand against Alexandra Harrington had inadvertently created an opening to examine the entire system that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. As she organized her materials for the meeting with Mendez, Olivia's phone pinged with a text message from an anonymous number. Check Harrington's subsidiaries in Atlanta, Chicago, and Miami for additional settlements. Pattern extends beyond main company. A friend. The message suggested that someone familiar with Harrington's operations was watching her reporting and wanted to help. The challenge would be verifying information from anonymous sources while maintaining journalistic standards, especially given Harrington's history of retaliating against critics. Olivia glanced at the wall of connections she had mapped out. The Reynolds incident had started as a simple passenger confrontation, but was rapidly evolving into an investigation that could potentially reshape how corporate America handled discrimination claims and investor influence. "This isn't just about one flight anymore," she murmured, adding another note to her growing map. By early evening, Olivia had compiled enough documented evidence to establish a clear pattern. Howard Harrington used his financial leverage to pressure companies into covering up discriminatory incidents, punishing employees who stood against such behavior, and imposing draconian confidentiality agreements on those who sought legal remedies. When she met Rafael Mendez at his hotel later that night, their combined knowledge created a comprehensive picture of how wealth and power had been weaponized to shield prejudice from accountability. "What makes the Reynolds case different," Mendez explained as they compared notes, "is that it happened in public, with multiple witnesses and recordings. Previous incidents were buried in private meetings and confidential settlements. And Reynolds himself seems immune to the usual pressure tactics," Olivia added. "He's already accepted the potential loss of his career rather than compromising his principles." "Precisely. Which makes him the perfect plaintiff for a test case that could establish new precedents for corporate accountability in discrimination cases." The timestamp was day 2 of the expanding investigation, and what had begun as a single incident on a transatlantic flight had evolved into a broader examination of how wealth and power could be weaponized to shield prejudice from accountability. Captain Marcus Reynolds' stand against Alexandra Harrington had inadvertently pulled on a thread that was now unraveling a carefully constructed system of influence and intimidation. In her London hotel room later that night, Olivia Jackson continued refining her investigation, aware that they had only scratched the surface of how financial power had been weaponized to maintain systems of privilege and exclusion. The story was no longer just about one flight, one captain, or even one billionaire. It was about the intersection of wealth, power, and accountability in modern corporate America. The Williams family impact. In their temporary London apartment, Nathan Williams watched his daughter Zoe arrange her stuffed animals on her new bed, trying to create a sense of familiarity in the unfamiliar space. Afternoon sunlight filtered through thin curtains, casting warm patterns across the generic rental furniture. The sounds of London traffic, double-decker buses, black cabs, the occasional siren, drifted up from the street below, constant reminders that they were far from home. Rex the dinosaur occupied the position of honor on her pillow, joined now by a small stuffed bear wearing a pilot's hat that Nathan had purchased at Heathrow after their arrival. The bear's fabric was still stiff with newness, contrasting with Rex's well-worn comfort. "What should we name him?" Nathan asked, gesturing to the bear. Zoe considered this seriously, her forehead wrinkling in concentration. "Captain," she decided after a moment, "because he's brave like the pilot who helped us." Ma, Nathan nodded, struck by how children often distilled complex situations to their essence. In Zoe's mind, Captain Reynolds was simply the brave pilot who helped us, rather than a man potentially losing his career for standing on principle. The past 24 hours had been disorienting. What should have been a straightforward relocation, challenging enough with all the logistics of an international move and Zoe's adjustment to a new country, had suddenly thrust them into a media spotlight neither had sought. Nathan's phone had been ringing constantly, with interview requests from news organizations around the world. His social media accounts, previously used primarily to share research papers and connect with other neurosurgeons, were now inundated with messages, most supportive, some questioning why he had caused trouble on the flight. "Daddy," Zoe's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Is the captain going to lose his job because of us?" The question hit Nathan hard. He sat down beside her on the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. Cardboard boxes of their belongings were stacked against the walls, still waiting to be unpacked, their life temporarily in limbo. "Not because of us, Zoe Bear, because some people don't like it when someone stands up against unfair treatment." "But that's not right," Zoe frowned, her 8-year-old sense of justice offended. "He was helping us." "I know, sweetheart. And that was the right thing to do. Sometimes doing the right thing has consequences, even when it shouldn't. He tried to find the right words to explain a complex situation to a child who still saw the world in simpler terms. Remember when you told Miss Harris that Jamie was cheating on the math test, and some of the kids stopped talking to you at recess? Zoe nodded, her eyes darkening at the memory. You did the right thing, but it had consequences that weren't fair. This is like that. But for grown-ups, Zoe thought about this, absently stroking Rex's worn fabric. We should help him then, since he helped us. Nathan had been wrestling with the same conclusion. As a neurosurgeon, he had deliberately maintained a low public profile, focusing on his research and practice rather than media attention. The sterile precision of the operating room was his natural environment, not the chaotic world of viral videos and public controversy, but the circumstances now seemed to demand a different approach. What do you think we should do? He asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Tell everyone he's a hero, Zoe said simply. So they know. From the mouths of babes, Nathan thought. His phone buzzed again. Another interview request. This time from BBC World News, asking if he would be willing to appear on their evening broadcast to discuss the incident. After putting Zoe to bed that night, Nathan sat in the sparse living room of their temporary apartment, weighing his options. His fellowship at the Royal Children's Hospital was prestigious, the kind of opportunity that could define a medical career. Public controversy wasn't typically beneficial in the conservative world of pediatric neurosurgery. Yet he couldn't shake the image of Captain Reynolds standing firmly as Alexandra Harrington had threatened his career, all because he had refused to allow a child to be humiliated for an accidental juice spill. Nathan's phone rang again. This time, it was the chief of surgery at Royal Children's Hospital. Dr. Williams, the British voice began. I've been watching the news coverage of your eventful journey to join us. Nathan tensed, preparing for a diplomatic warning about avoiding controversy. Yes, sir. It wasn't how we planned to start our time in London. Quite, the chief replied. Then, unexpectedly, I want you to know that the hospital stands fully behind you in this matter. What happened on that flight was unacceptable, and we support you speaking up if you choose to do so. Relief washed over Nathan. Thank you, sir. I've been concerned about how my involvement might affect the fellowship. On the contrary, Dr. Williams, your measured response to discrimination reflects exactly the kind of character we value at this institution. Medicine isn't just about technical skill, it's about advocating for those in vulnerable positions. After the call, Nathan made his decision. He sent a message accepting the BBC interview request. With one condition, it must be scheduled after Zoe's bedtime, as he wanted to protect her from additional media exposure. The next evening, Nathan appeared on BBC World News, his surgical precision evident in how carefully he chose his words. The studio lights were hot on his face. Makeup artists had dusted his forehead to prevent shine, and the earpiece felt foreign with one, but his voice remained steady. What happened on that flight goes beyond a single incident of rudeness or entitlement, he explained calmly. When Ms. Harrington demanded that my daughter and I be moved to the back where we belong, she was invoking a long, painful history of exclusion and segregation. The interviewer nodded. And Captain Reynolds' response, he did what any person in authority should do when witnessing discrimination. He didn't look away. He didn't prioritize convenience or schedule or status. He prioritized human dignity. Nathan paused, then continued with quiet intensity. Now, Captain Reynolds is facing the potential end of his career because he refused to allow a child, my child, to be humiliated. If we accept that outcome, what message does it send about our values as a society? The interview was measured, thoughtful, and devastatingly effective precisely because of Nathan's restraint. He never raised his voice, never made sweeping accusations, but simply laid out the facts as they had occurred and asked viewers to consider the implications. Within hours, clips from the interview were being shared across social media platforms, accompanied by captions like, "Father of child targeted on Flight 892 speaks out," and Dr. Williams' powerful testimony about Captain Reynolds' courage. A Reddit thread discussing the interview reached the front page with over 47,000 upvotes and comments that reflected the public's emotional connection to the story. The way he talks about the captain standing up for his daughter has me in tears. This is what real allyship looks like. The captain risked everything to do the right thing. Imagine being that little girl and seeing an adult in authority actually protect you from racism. The timestamp was day 3 of the evolving story, and what had begun as a confrontation between a captain and a passenger had transformed into a broader conversation about moral courage, corporate ethics, and the price of standing against discrimination. In their London apartment, Nathan checked on Zoe after returning from the BBC studios. She was asleep, Rex and Captain the Bear tucked securely under her arm. In her innocent question, "We should help him then, since he helped us," she had captured the essence of reciprocal moral obligation that adults often complicated with calculations of personal risk and professional consequence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including Zoe's first day at her London school and Nathan's orientation at the hospital. But tonight he had honored the simple truth his daughter had recognized: when someone stands up for you, you stand up for them in return. Corporate betrayal. The Atlantic Global Airlines boardroom on the 30th floor of their Chicago headquarters had never felt more divided. 14 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, expressions ranging from grim determination to barely concealed discomfort as CEO Daniel Foster delivered the recommendation that had been formulated over the past 3 days. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline was partly obscured by gathering storm clouds, an appropriate backdrop for the decision they were about to make. The room smelled of expensive cologne, leather portfolios, and the faint pine scent of the cleaning products used on the table. After thorough review of the incident on Flight 892, the Executive Committee recommends the termination of Captain Marcus Reynolds for violations of company procedures resulting in unnecessary delays, customer dissatisfaction, and damage to Atlantic Global's brand reputation. Foster's voice carried no conviction, as if he were reading a script written by someone else. His tie seemed unusually tight around his neck, and a light sheen of sweat was visible on his forehead, despite the perfectly regulated temperature of the boardroom. Patricia Morgan, VP of Operations, visibly bristled at these words but maintained her professional composure. "May I ask what specific procedures Captain Reynolds violated? Because my review of the incident found his actions completely aligned with our own dignity and respect guidelines." Foster looked uncomfortable, avoiding her direct gaze. "Patricia, we've been over this in the executive session. The determination is that Captain Reynolds failed to exhaust all intermediate conflict resolution options before taking the drastic step of removing a premium passenger." "That's not accurate, and it's not in the official incident report," Patricia countered, her voice level but firm. She tapped her finger on the document in front of her. "Captain Reynolds offered Ms. Harrington multiple options, including seat relocation and assistance with her shoe, all of which she rejected. Removal was the last resort, not the first. The video evidence supports Patricia's assessment," added board member Thomas Wilson, a former pilot himself. "I've watched the footage multiple times. Reynolds gave Harrington clear choices and adequate time to comply." James Wilson, the PR director, cleared his throat. "The public relations dimension can't be ignored. While social media sentiment strongly favors Captain Reynolds, our key business partners and institutional investors have expressed serious concerns about our handling of high-value customers." "By key business partners, you mean Harrington Financial Group," Patricia said bluntly, the words landing like stones on the polished table. The tension in the room thickened. Everyone present knew the unspoken reality. Howard Harrington had made explicit threats about Atlantic Global's financing if Reynolds wasn't terminated, but no one wanted to acknowledge this on the record. "The company's financial stability must be our priority," Foster continued, steering the conversation away from Harrington specifically. "The Asian expansion requires significant capital investment that could be jeopardized by this situation. So we're firing a 32-year employee with an unblemished record because he enforced our own anti-discrimination policies," Patricia summarized, her voice taking on an edge. "A black captain who stood up against racist behavior is being terminated to appease a billionaire investor." "That characterization is unfair," Foster objected, though his lack of eye contact suggested otherwise. "This is about established protocols and the financial health of the entire airline." The board chair, Richard Thompson, intervened. "We need to move to a vote. The recommendation before us is to terminate Captain Reynolds' employment effective immediately, with a separation agreement that includes 6 months severance and standard non-disclosure provisions. Patricia looked around the table at her fellow executives, some of whom couldn't meet her gaze. The wooden chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. The corporate portraits of previous CEOs seemed to stare down in judgment from the walls. Before we vote, I want the record to show my formal objection. This decision undermines our entire corporate value statement and sends a devastating message to our diverse workforce about whose dignity actually matters at Atlantic Global. The vote proceeded despite her objection, 11 in favor of termination, 3 opposed. As the meeting concluded, Foster pulled Patricia aside. I know you're upset, but this is business. We have 27,000 employees to consider. And now they all know exactly where they stand if they ever have to choose between doing what's right and what's convenient. Patricia replied coldly. Congratulations on teaching them that lesson so clearly. Elsewhere in the Atlantic Global Operational Headquarters, First Officer Miguel Hernandez sat uncomfortably in a small conference room as 2 members of the airline's internal investigation team questioned him about the events on Flight 892. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows, making everyone look slightly ill. Just to be clear, did Captain Reynolds consult with you before making the decision to remove Mrs. Harrington? Asked the lead investigator, a former FAA official whose expression revealed nothing. Miguel hesitated, the memory of his own silence in that crucial moment weighing on him. No, he made the determination independently. And in your professional opinion, were there alternatives that could have resolved the situation without removing the passenger and delaying the flight? Another hesitation. Miguel knew what they wanted him to say. He knew that his own career prospects hung in the balance. The path of least resistance was clear, confirm the narrative that Reynolds had overreacted, and position himself as the reasonable professional who would have found a less disruptive solution. The procedures manual offers several intermediate conflict resolution options, he said carefully. Captain Reynolds could have... He stopped, the image of Zoe Williams' tearful face suddenly vivid in his memory. The way she had clutched her stuffed dinosaur as Alexandra Harrington had demanded they be moved to the back where they belong. The quiet dignity with which Dr. Williams had absorbed the insults while trying to protect his daughter. Captain Reynolds could have what? First Officer Hernandez, the investigator prompted, pen poised above notepad. Miguel straightened in his chair, making a decision that surprised even himself. The hard plastic chair creaked under his shifted weight. Captain Reynolds could have done exactly what every other pilot I've ever flown with would have done. Looked the other way, prioritized the schedule, and let that child be humiliated in the name of operational efficiency. But he didn't, because he's a better pilot and a better man than most of us. The investigators exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response from someone they had assumed would support the official narrative. That's not quite what we're asking, one began. It's exactly what you're asking. Miguel interrupted, his voice gaining strength with each word. You want me to give you cover for firing him? I won't do it. Put in your report that First Officer Hernandez believes Captain Reynolds acted with absolute professionalism and in full accordance with Atlantic Global's stated values of dignity and respect for all passengers. While Miguel was making his stand, Carmen Diaz faced similar pressure in another conference room. As the head flight attendant who had witnessed the entire incident, her testimony was crucial to the company's effort to justify Reynolds' termination. Ms. Diaz, would you say that Captain Reynolds' intervention was premature? That the cabin crew could have resolved the situation without his involvement? The HR representative asked, her voice professionally neutral. Carmen's response was immediate and firm. Absolutely not. Ms. Harrington's behavior was escalating, with clear discriminatory overtones. Captain Reynolds assessed the situation correctly and intervened appropriately. But there were other options available. There were not. Carmen cut in, her professional demeanor momentarily cracking. Ms. Harrington had rejected every solution offered, from cleaning her shoe to changing seats. She was explicitly demanding that Dr. Williams and his daughter be removed from premium economy and seated in the back where they belong. Those were her exact words. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. Would you like me to elaborate on the racist implications of that specific phrasing? Because I'd be happy to explain it for the record. We understand that Ms. Harrington's behavior was inappropriate, the HR representative allowed, backpedaling slightly. The question is whether Captain Reynolds followed proper protocol in his response. Carmen's eyes narrowed. Atlantic Global's first stated value is, "We treat all people with dignity and respect." Captain Reynolds was the only person in authority who fully honored that value on Flight 892. If that's not proper protocol, then perhaps the protocol needs to be changed, not the captain. Despite these powerful testimonies, the decision had already been made at the highest levels. By late afternoon, the public announcement was prepared, vetted by legal counsel, and distributed to media outlets. Atlantic Global Airlines announces the termination of Captain Marcus Reynolds for violations of company procedures on Flight 892 from Chicago to London. This decision follows a thorough investigation and is consistent with our commitment to operational excellence and passenger safety. Atlantic Global appreciates Captain Reynolds' 32 years of service and wishes him well in his future endeavors. The sanitized corporate language masks the reality of what had occurred. A principled stand against discrimination had been sacrificed on the altar of financial expediency. The company had chosen its relationship with a powerful investor over its stated values of dignity and respect. The timestamp was day 4 of the unfolding story, and Atlantic Global Airlines had just made a critical miscalculation. In attempting to appease Howard Harrington with a quiet termination, they had instead created a corporate ethics case study that would be taught in business schools for decades to come. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. #boycott Atlantic Global began trending within hours of the announcement. Passengers shared videos of themselves cutting up their Atlantic Global frequent flyer cards. Competing airlines issued statements reaffirming their commitment to anti-discrimination policies. Civil rights organizations announced plans for protests at Atlantic Global ticket counters nationwide. A TikTok video of a flight attendant from a competing airline went viral with 3.7 million views POV. When your airline fires someone for doing the right thing, but you still have to show up to work tomorrow. #Atlantic Global walkout. #Captain Integrity. What the board had failed to recognize was that in the court of public opinion, Captain Marcus Reynolds had already been vindicated by the unfiltered truth captured on dozens of passenger videos. The corporate betrayal of his principles would not go unanswered, either by the public or by those within the company who recognized that some values truly were non-negotiable. The whistleblower, Emma Richardson, had worked in Atlantic Global's corporate communications department for 7 years, gradually rising to become assistant director of internal communications. Her role gave her access to executive email threads and board meeting minutes that few others in the company could see. She had always been a loyal employee, proud of the airline's stated commitment to diversity and ethical leadership. Until now, sitting in her Chicago apartment at 2:00 a.m., Emma stared at her computer screen. The fateful email thread still open. The blue light from the monitor cast strange shadows across her living room, where a half-eaten dinner sat forgotten on the coffee table. Outside, Chicago's elevated trains rumbled past periodically, their rhythmic clatter matching her racing heartbeat. It had begun 3 days earlier with a message from CEO Daniel Foster to the executive team. From Foster. Daniel to executive team, subject Harrington situation. Confidential. Team, I've just concluded a call with Howard Harrington regarding the incident on Flight 892. He was explicit in his demands that Captain Reynolds must be terminated immediately, not just suspended. Harrington stated clearly that their $200 million current investment and the pending $300 million Asian expansion funding are contingent on our appropriate handling of this situation. I don't like being strong-armed, but the financial realities are undeniable. Without Harrington's continued investment, our Q3 numbers will trigger loan covenant violations, and the Asian expansion will be delayed indefinitely. We need to construct a credible justification for termination based on procedural violations rather than the actual incident. Legal is drafting language now. This correspondence is strictly confidential. Daniel, the subsequent thread included discussions of how to pressure First Officer Hernandez to provide damaging testimony, how to frame the termination to minimize legal exposure, an explicit acknowledgement that Reynolds had actually followed all applicable procedures correctly. One particularly disturbing message from the legal team suggested, searching for past incidents we can retroactively connect to establish a pattern of behavioral concerns. EMS had watched silently as the company she believed in systematically constructed a false narrative to justify firing a man whose only crime was refusing to allow discrimination on his aircraft. The breaking point had come earlier that day when she had been asked to draft talking points for flight attendants to use if passengers asked about Reynolds' termination. The suggested language, Captain Reynolds failed to follow established conflict resolution protocols, was a direct contradiction of what Emma knew to be true from the internal communications. After hours of moral wrestling, she had made her decision. She couldn't be complicit in this corporate betrayal of both Reynolds and the company's own stated values. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through the emails again, questioning herself one last time. Her career would likely be over once the leak was traced back to her. The communications team was small enough that the investigation wouldn't take long. Her newly approved mortgage for a modest condo in Lincoln Park flashed through her mind. Would she still qualify if she lost her job? The student loan she was still paying off at 35 would become much more burdensome without her corporate salary. But the alternative, remaining silent while a good man was destroyed for doing the right thing, was ultimately more costly to her sense of self. She had carefully selected key emails from the thread, removed identifying information that could reveal her as the source, and sent them to 3 recipients: Olivia Jackson at the Wall Street Journal, Rafael Mendez at the civil rights law firm that had begun advocating for Reynolds, and Patricia Morgan, the VP of operations who had been the lone executive voice consistently defending Reynolds. Now, having taken this irrevocable step, Emma sat in the darkness of her apartment, alternating between conviction that she had done the right thing and terror at the personal consequences she would likely face when the leak was discovered. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Documents received. Your identity will be protected. Thank you for your courage. The message from Olivia Jackson provided small comfort. Emma knew that Harrington's influence extended throughout the industry. When she was identified as the whistleblower, her career in corporate communications would likely be over. Some prices were worth paying. That was the lesson Captain Reynolds had demonstrated, and Emma had taken it to heart. By 6:00 a.m., the first article appeared on the Wall Street Journal's website. Exclusive internal emails reveal Atlantic Global fired captain under direct threat from billionaire investor. Olivia Jackson's reporting was meticulous, quoting directly from the leaked emails while protecting the source's identity. The article detailed how Atlantic Global executives had acknowledged Reynolds' adherence to procedure while simultaneously constructing a false narrative to justify his termination. Most damaging was the explicit connection between Howard Harrington's financial threats and the airline's decision to fire Reynolds. The story exploded across news platforms and social media, transforming what had been a contentious but relatively contained incident into a full-blown corporate ethics scandal. Atlantic Global's stock dropped 7% in pre-market trading as investors reacted to the revelation of governance issues and potential legal exposure. At Atlantic Global's headquarters, the mood was panic-stricken. An emergency board meeting was convened via conference call, with members demanding explanations from Foster about the leaked communications. "How the hell did these emails get to the Wall Street Journal?" demanded board chair Richard Thompson, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "We're investigating the breach now," Foster replied, sounding exhausted and defeated. "It is auditing all access logs." "That's not the issue," Thompson shouted. "The issue is that you explicitly documented Harrington's threats and our capitulation in writing. What were you thinking?" The conversation deteriorated from there, with board members more concerned about the exposure of their decision-making process than about the ethical implications of what they had done. Meanwhile, in London, Carmen Diaz received a call from Patricia Morgan. "Carmen, have you seen the news?" Patricia asked without preamble. "The leaked emails, yes. Everyone's talking about it." The hotel room felt suddenly smaller as Carmen processed the implications. "They've been lying to us all along. We knew it, but seeing it in writing, I need to know if you're willing to go on the record about what you witnessed on Flight 892. The company's official statement contradicts what actually happened, and your first-hand account would be powerful." Carmen hesitated only briefly. "Yes, I'll do it. What Reynolds did was right, and I won't be part of the company's attempt to rewrite history." "There could be consequences for you," Patricia warned. "There were already consequences for standing silent." Carmen replied, I've made my choice." By mid-morning, Carmen Diaz had issued a public statement through Rafael Mendez's law firm, providing a detailed account of the incident that directly contradicted Atlantic Global's official narrative. Her statement concluded with a powerful declaration: As a 10-year employee of Atlantic Global Airlines, I am deeply disappointed in the company's decision to terminate Captain Reynolds for upholding the very values we claim to embrace. What I witnessed on Flight 892 was a captain with the moral courage to ensure that every passenger was treated with dignity, regardless of their age, race, or financial status. If that is now grounds for termination at Atlantic Global, then we have lost our way as a company. Across the Atlantic, the developments continued to unfold. First Officer Miguel Hernandez, having seen the leaked emails and Carmen's statement, contacted Rafael Mendez to recant his earlier testimony. I was pressured to characterize Captain Reynolds' actions as procedurally improper. Miguel admitted in his signed statement, "The truth is that he acted with complete professionalism throughout the incident, and I regret not supporting him more strongly at the time." By early afternoon, the Federal Aviation Administration had announced an investigation into whether Atlantic Global Airlines had violated anti-discrimination protocols in their handling of the incident. The Department of Transportation issued a statement confirming they were reviewing whether the airline had breached civil rights protections under federal transportation regulations. Most concerning for Howard Harrington, the Securities and Exchange Commission indicated they were examining whether the billionaire's financial threats constituted improper investor influence under securities regulations. A Reddit thread analyzing the legal implications reached the front page with over 37,000 upvotes. Legal breakdown: why Atlantic Global and Harrington are totally fucked after these leaked emails. The top comment with 12.4K upvotes read, "Corporate lawyer here. These emails are the smoking gun in any wrongful termination suit. Reynolds just went from maybe winning to definitely winning, and the damages just multiplied exponentially." The timestamp was day 5 of what had now become known widely as the Reynolds incident, and the story had evolved far beyond its origins as a confrontation over a juice spill. What had begun as Howard Harrington's attempt to punish a captain who had stood up to his wife had catalyzed a broader examination of corporate ethics, investor influence, and the real-world application of anti-discrimination principles. In her Chicago apartment, Emma Richardson watched the unfolding consequences of her decision to leak the emails, alternating between satisfaction that the truth was emerging and anxiety about her own future. She had not anticipated the cascade effect, how one act of whistleblowing would inspire others like Carmen and Miguel to find their own courage, creating a domino effect of truth-telling that no amount of corporate damage control could contain. What none of them knew yet was that this was only the beginning. The spotlight now turning toward Harrington Financial Group would soon illuminate far more than one incident of discrimination on a transatlantic flight. The whistleblower had cracked open a door that many had tried to keep firmly shut, and what lay beyond would transform an industry. Part 4, the Investigation Financial Journalist Coalition. In the 5 days since Flight 892 had landed at Heathrow, Olivia Jackson had barely slept. Her London hotel room had been transformed into an impromptu investigative headquarters, with documents covering every surface and her laptop constantly open to communication channels with colleagues across the globe. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, takeout food containers, and the particular smell of papers that had been handled too many times. What had begun as her individual reporting on the Reynolds incident had evolved into something much larger, a coordinated investigation involving financial journalists from multiple publications, all focused on different aspects of Howard Harrington's business empire. The whistleblower emails were just the beginning. Olivia explained during a secure video conference with her expanding coalition of reporters. They proved Harrington's willingness to use financial leverage to punish those who stand against discrimination. But our preliminary research suggests this is part of a much broader pattern. The call included financial reporters from the New York Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Financial Times, each bringing specialized expertise to the growing investigation. Their faces filled Olivia's laptop screen, serious expressions illuminated by the blue glow of their own screens from various time zones. My team has identified 27 executives who were abruptly removed from companies shortly after Harrington Financial Group increased its investment position, said Jeremy Torres from Bloomberg, gray streaks in his beard reflecting his decades of experience covering Wall Street. 17 of them were minorities, and 23 had recently championed diversity initiatives within their organizations. He shared his screen, displaying a detailed timeline that showed how quickly these removals had occurred under Harrington's investment, typically within 60 to 90 days. Sarah Mitchell from the Financial Times added, "We've been examining Harrington's lending practices through their banking subsidiaries. The data shows consistent disparities in loan approvals, and interest rates based on applicants' race, even when controlling for credit scores and income levels. Her British accent lent additional gravity to the statistical evidence she presented. Approval rates for white applicants were 73%, compared to 42% for black applicants with identical financial profiles. The pattern extends to their real estate investments as well, noted Michael Baker from the New York Times. Harrington-owned properties in mixed-race neighborhoods have significantly higher eviction rates for minority tenants than for white tenants with similar payment histories. He shared documentation showing eviction rates that were 58% higher for black tenants and 47% higher for Hispanic tenants. Even when payment history and lease violations were comparable, Olivia integrated these findings with her own research, which focused specifically on how Harrington used his investment positions to influence corporate policies and personnel decisions. The emerging picture was damning, a systematic pattern of using financial power to maintain what internal communications referred to as traditional corporate culture across the companies in Harrington's portfolio. The Reynolds incident is unique because it happened in public, with multiple witnesses and video evidence, Olivia observed. Previous cases were handled behind closed doors, with NDAs and financial settlements ensuring silence. The journalists established a secure database where they could cross-reference their findings while maintaining the editorial independence of their respective publications. They agreed on a coordinated publication schedule to ensure maximum impact while minimizing Harrington's ability to control the narrative through his considerable media connections. "We need to be meticulous with verification," cautioned Olivia. "Harrington is known for aggressive legal tactics against journalists. Every claim needs multiple sources and unimpeachable documentation." By the end of week 2, their combined investigation had uncovered substantial evidence, statistical analysis showing systematic discrimination in Harrington Financial Group's lending practices, with denial rates for minority applicants 31% higher than industry averages, documentation of discriminatory hiring and promotion patterns within Harrington-controlled companies, with minority executives 68% less likely to advance to senior leadership, a pattern of executive removals following diversity initiatives, with 87% of executives who championed inclusion programs being removed within 90 days of Harrington gaining significant investment positions, internal communications referring to maintaining appropriate corporate culture when discussing personnel decisions, code for preserving predominantly white leadership, 7 additional confidential settlements with former employees who had raised concerns about discriminatory practices, totaling over $47 million. The findings were compiled into a comprehensive dossier that painted a clear picture of how Harrington's business empire had systematically disadvantaged minorities while using financial leverage to silence critics and punish those who challenged discriminatory practices. On day 14 of the evolving story, the first coordinated articles appeared across major financial publications. Wall Street Journal Beyond Flight 892, How Harrington Financial Group Systematically Punishes Diversity Advocates. Bloomberg, The Harrington Pattern Statistical Evidence of Discriminatory Practices Across Multiple Industries. Financial Times, Banking While Black Data Reveals Racial Disparities in Harrington-Controlled Lending Institutions. New York Times, Corporate Culture by Coercion, How Billionaire Influence Shapes Diversity Outcomes. The impact was immediate and substantial. Harrington Financial Group's stock dropped 12% in a single day as investors reacted to both the revelations and the potential regulatory and legal exposure they represented. Corporate partners began publicly distancing themselves from Harrington Ventures, and institutional investors issued statements expressing concern about governance issues. Howard Harrington's response was predictable, a blanket denial accompanied by threats of legal action against the publications for what he termed defamatory reporting. His PR team worked overtime to characterize the coordinated investigation as a witch hunt, motivated by anti-business sentiment, rather than legitimate journalistic inquiry. But the financial data spoke for itself. The statistical patterns were clear enough that by the end of the week, multiple regulatory agencies had announced formal investigations into Harrington Financial Group's practices. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau launched an examination of lending disparities in Harrington-controlled banks. The Department of Labor initiated a review of employment practices across Harrington's corporate holdings. The Securities and Exchange Commission expanded its inquiry into investor influence and disclosure issues. The Federal Reserve announced a special examination of Harrington's banking subsidiaries. A Reddit post comparing Harrington's financial disclosures with the journalist's findings quickly gained traction. with users collaboratively identifying additional patterns that even the professional reporters had missed, breaking Harrington Financial's suspicious stock trades before 7 diversity officer firings. The thread included stock charts showing unusual trading activity in the days before announcements of executive changes, suggesting potential securities violations beyond the discrimination issues. What Howard Harrington had failed to understand was that while his financial power could intimidate individuals and even corporations, it was no match for the combined resources of major financial publications committed to exposing the truth. The journalistic coalition that Olivia Jackson had assembled represented a form of countervailing power that Harrington's usual tactics of legal threats and financial pressure couldn't easily neutralize. The timestamp was Week 2 of the expanding investigation, and what had begun as a single incident on a transatlantic flight had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how wealth and power had been used to shield discriminatory practices from accountability. Captain Marcus Reynolds' stand against Alexandra Harrington had inadvertently pulled on a thread that was now unraveling a carefully constructed system of influence and intimidation. In her London hotel room, Olivia Jackson continued coordinating the expanding investigation, aware that they had only scratched the surface of how financial power had been weaponized to maintain systems of privilege and exclusion. The story was no longer just about one flight, one captain, or even one billionaire. It was about the intersection of wealth, power, and accountability in modern corporate America. Reynolds fights back. Marcus Reynolds sat in the office of Gabriela Rodriguez, one of Chicago's most respected employment attorneys, reviewing the termination documents Atlantic Global had sent him. After 2 weeks of silence and suspension, the airline had finally made the decision official. His 32-year career was over, terminated for violations of company procedures that both he and they knew were fabrications. The office was warm and inviting, deliberately designed to put clients at ease, soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and plants that added life to the professional space. Through the window, Chicago's skyline stretched toward Lake Michigan, the city where Marcus had based his career, now the backdrop for its potential end. They're offering 6 months severance if you sign their non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement, Gabriela noted, highlighting the relevant sections of the document. Her practiced eye had immediately identified the most restrictive clauses. Standard corporate practice when they know they're on shaky legal ground. Marcus studied the agreement, his expression hardening as he read the expansive language. Employee agrees not to make any statements, written or verbal, or cause or encourage others to make any statements, written or verbal, that defame, disparage, or in any way criticize the personal or business reputation, practices, or conduct of the company. They want me to stay silent about why I was really fired, he observed, the paper crinkling slightly in his tightening grip. Pretend I actually violated procedures rather than stood up against discrimination. Exactly, Baum, Gabriela confirmed. And based on the evidence we've seen, including the leaked emails and testimony from your colleagues, we have grounds for a strong wrongful termination lawsuit. Marcus leaned back in his chair, weighing his options. The 6 months severance would help with immediate financial pressures, the mortgage on their modest home, Amara's medical school expenses, the everyday costs of living, but at the cost of his ability to speak the truth about what had happened. The lawsuit offered potential vindication, but would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately uncertain. What would you advise, he asked. Gabriela considered carefully before responding, her 20 years of fighting corporate malfeasance evident in the thoughtful way she formulated her answer. From a purely financial perspective, taking the settlement might make sense. From a justice perspective, I believe you have a case worth fighting, especially with the public support you're receiving. That support had been overwhelming and unexpected. In the 2 weeks since Flight 892, Marcus had received thousands of messages from fellow pilots, flight attendants, and passengers who had witnessed similar incidents of discrimination on flights. The pilots' union had issued a strong statement questioning Atlantic Global's decision, and civil rights organizations had held press conferences denouncing his termination. Most surprising had been the GoFundMe campaign started by Dr. Nathan Williams from London, which had raised over $1.2 million in just 48 hours to support Marcus's legal expenses and living costs during what promised to be a protracted fight. I never expected this kind of response, Marcus admitted, gesturing to the tablet displaying the fundraiser's progress. I was just doing my job as I understood it. You were doing something more important, Gabriella corrected him. You were demonstrating moral leadership when it would have been easier to look away. That resonates with people because so many of us have been in situations where we wish someone in authority had stood up for what was right. The weight of the decision pressed on Marcus. Accepting the settlement would provide immediate financial security, but require him to remain silent about the truth. Fighting meant risking everything on a legal battle against a powerful corporation with vastly greater resources. What about the whistleblower emails? He asked. Do they strengthen our case? Dramatically, Gabriella confirmed. They established that Atlantic Global terminated you in direct response to Harrington's financial threats, not because of any legitimate performance concerns. They also revealed the company's deliberate effort to construct a false narrative about your actions. Marcus made his decision. I won't sign their agreement. We'll fight this. The relief he felt at saying those words out loud surprised him, as if some part of him had been holding his breath since the suspension had begun. Within hours, his legal team had filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Atlantic Global Airlines, alleging discrimination, retaliation, and violation of whistleblower protections. The lawsuit named not only the airline but also Howard Harrington personally, citing his improper interference in employment decisions as a major investor. The filing coincided with Marcus's first public interview since his termination, carefully coordinated with Gabriella to ensure he made no statements that could undermine the legal case. I was taught in the Air Force that command comes with responsibility, Marcus explained to the CNN interviewer, his composure unwavering despite the circumstances. That responsibility includes ensuring every person under your command is treated with dignity and respect. And you believe Atlantic Global terminated you for upholding that principle? The interviewer asked. The evidence speaks for itself. Marcus replied carefully. I followed company procedure precisely. The leaked emails confirmed that my termination was related to financial pressure from a major investor whose wife was involved in the incident. How has this affected you personally and professionally? Marcus paused, the question touching on the private struggles he and Diana had been facing. 32 years of service ended without just cause. That's difficult to process. But I sleep well at night knowing I did the right thing. I would make the same decision again, even knowing the consequences. The interview struck a powerful chord with viewers. Marcus's quiet dignity and unwavering commitment to principle contrasted sharply with the corporate doublespeak of Atlantic Global's official statements. His eloquent explanation of command responsibility resonated particularly with veterans and active duty military personnel, who began sharing their own stories of moral leadership under pressure. This is what real leadership looks like, tweeted a retired Air Force general, sharing a clip from the interview that quickly garnered over 200,000 likes. The pilots' union moved beyond statements of support to direct action, filing an amicus brief in support of the lawsuit and establishing a support fund for Marcus separate from the GoFundMe campaign. Flight attendants' unions joined as well, with Carmen Diaz emerging as a powerful spokesperson for crew members who had witnessed discrimination but felt powerless to address it under existing corporate structures. Captain Reynolds did what every airline employee wishes they could do when witnessing discriminatory behavior. Carmen explained in her own media appearances. He prioritized human dignity over schedule efficiency and customer status. His termination sends a chilling message to every employee about what our company truly values. The public and professional support created a powerful counter-narrative to Atlantic Global's attempts to characterize the termination as a routine personnel matter. The company's stock continued to decline as investors recognized the potential financial and reputational damage from a prolonged public fight with a 32-year veteran whose only offense had been upholding the company's own stated values. By week 2 of the legal battle, the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict decisively in Marcus's favor. The GoFundMe campaign had reached $1.8 million, with contributions from over 47,000 individuals, ranging from fellow pilots to passengers who had never met him but recognized the significance of his stand. Howard Harrington's attempts to pressure media outlets to reduce coverage of the story backfired, generating additional articles about Billionaire attempts to control narratives. Several outlets published exposés on media organizations that had suddenly killed stories about the Reynolds case, tracing their ownership back to Harrington-related investments. Most powerful was Marcus's consistent message throughout his media appearances. This isn't about me or my job. This is about whether we as a society believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their age, race, or economic status. And it's about whether corporations will uphold their stated values when doing so becomes financially inconvenient. This framing elevated the case beyond a simple employment dispute to a referendum on corporate ethics and moral leadership. Business schools began incorporating the Reynolds case into their ethics curricula, examining the tensions between shareholder interests, stated corporate values, and individual moral agency. A TikTok video of a business ethics professor explaining the case reached 2.1 million views with the caption, "Prof explains why the hashtag Captain Integrity case will be in textbooks for the next 50 years, hashtag corporate ethics 101. The timestamp was week 2 of Marcus Reynolds' counteroffensive, and what had begun as one captain's stand against discrimination had evolved into a broader movement questioning the relationship between corporate power, investor influence, and ethical leadership. Marcus had lost his job, but in doing so, he had inadvertently become the catalyst for a conversation that extended far beyond one flight or one airline. In their Chicago home, Marcus and Diana Reynolds reviewed the latest updates from Gabriella about the legal proceedings. The path ahead would be long and uncertain, but they were no longer walking it alone. Thousands of people had rallied around the principle Marcus had defended, transforming a personal and professional setback into something much more significant. "I never wanted to be a symbol or start a movement," Marcus confessed to Diana as they prepared for bed. "I just wanted to do my job the right way." "Sometimes doing the right thing becomes something bigger than you intended," Diana replied, squeezing his hand. "That doesn't make it any less right." The federal investigation. The imposing headquarters of the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D1C, had seen countless financial investigations throughout its history, but few had generated the intensity of focus now directed at Harrington Financial Group. 3 weeks after the Flight 892 incident, representatives from multiple federal agencies gathered in a secure conference room to coordinate their overlapping investigations. The room was deliberately austere, no windows, plain walls, a long table with government-issued chairs, and the subtle hum of electronic counter-surveillance equipment. The only decoration was the SEC seal mounted on the wall, a reminder of the regulatory authority present in the room. "Let's begin with the SEC's findings," said Elizabeth Chen, the seasoned enforcement director leading the meeting. Her crisp blazer and no-nonsense demeanor reflected 20 years of pursuing financial malfeasance through complex corporate structures. "Our preliminary investigation has identified potential violations in 3 key areas." She displayed a detailed chart on the main screen, breaking down the issues. Investor influence evidence, suggesting Howard Harrington used his position as a major investor to improperly influence personnel decisions at multiple companies, potentially violating securities regulations regarding material disclosures, disclosure violations, failure to properly disclose potential regulatory and legal exposure related to discriminatory practices in financial filings, market manipulation, patterns of stock transactions surrounding the removal of executives who champion diversity initiatives, suggesting potential insider trading. "The leaked emails from Atlantic Global provide our clearest evidence of improper investor influence," Chen continued, highlighting key passages on her presentation. They directly connect Harrington's financial threats to the termination of Captain Reynolds, creating a troubling precedent for corporate governance. James Wilson from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division added his agency's perspective. "We've identified a pattern of discrimination that extends well beyond the Atlantic Global incident. Our analysis shows systematic disadvantaging of minorities across Harrington-controlled companies, from hiring and promotion to lending practices and tenant selection." He distributed binders containing statistical analyses that showed consistent disparities that could not be explained by legitimate business factors. Representatives from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and Federal Reserve presented additional findings related to Harrington's banking subsidiaries, where statistical analysis had revealed significant disparities in loan approvals and interest rates based on applicants' race, even when controlling for credit scores, income levels, and other relevant factors. The pattern becomes even more concerning when we examine the geographical distribution, noted Maria Rodriguez from the CFPB, pointing to a heat map on her tablet. Harrington-owned banks consistently underserve predominantly minority neighborhoods, with loan denial rates 63% higher than in comparable white neighborhoods with similar economic profiles. The data visualization showed stark contrast between lending patterns in different neighborhoods, with red zones indicating areas where Harrington banks had minimal presence despite market opportunity. As the various agencies shared their findings, a comprehensive picture emerged of how Harrington Financial Group had used its vast resources to create and maintain systems of advantage and disadvantage based on race, and how it had consistently punished those who challenged these practices. The Federal Reserve representative, Jonathan Davis, summarized the regulatory perspective. What makes this case particularly significant is the connection between discriminatory practices and corporate governance. Harrington didn't just tolerate discrimination, he actively intervened to protect it when challenged, using his financial leverage to remove those who stood against it. Elizabeth Chen nodded in agreement. That's why we've expanded our investigation beyond the Atlantic Global incident to examine similar patterns across Harrington's investment portfolio. We've identified 7 other executives who were removed shortly after challenging discriminatory practices at Harrington-controlled companies. The coordinated federal investigation moved with unusual speed, driven by the clear evidence in the leaked emails and the public attention the case had attracted. Subpoenas were issued for internal communications, financial records, and testimony from key executives across the Harrington empire. Howard Harrington himself received a subpoena to testify before the SEC regarding his communications with Atlantic Global and other companies where similar patterns had been identified. His initial response, a motion to quash the subpoena filed by his legal team, only intensified regulatory scrutiny and public suspicion. Innocent people don't typically fight appearing under oath, observed one legal analyst on CNBC. Harrington's aggressive resistance to the subpoena suggests he's worried about what might emerge during testimony. And as the federal investigation proceeded, it uncovered additional evidence that strengthened the case against Harrington Financial Group. Internal memos discussing the need to maintain appropriate demographic balance in leadership positions, with specific instructions to avoid hiring candidates who might disrupt our established culture, performance evaluations that rated minority employees more harshly than white counterparts with similar accomplishments, with coded language like "not a cultural fit" appearing disproportionately in reviews of non-white staff email threads joking about diversity hires and their qualifications, with senior executives, including Harrington himself, participating in exchanges that created a hostile environment, statistical evidence showing systematic discrimination in lending, hiring, and promotion across multiple Harrington-controlled entities. The investigation's expanding scope also revealed connections to political influence, with evidence suggesting that Harrington had used campaign contributions and lobbying efforts to shield his business practices from regulatory scrutiny in the past. By week 3, the federal investigation had become a major news story in its own right, with daily updates on new findings and potential charges. Howard Harrington's initial strategy of dismissing the investigation as politically motivated lost credibility as the evidence mounted from multiple independent agencies, each finding similar patterns within their respective jurisdictions. The most damaging revelation came when investigators discovered a confidential memo from Harrington's legal department, drafted 2 years earlier, warning about potential liability related to discriminatory practices within the organization. The memo explicitly acknowledged statistical disparities in lending and hiring while recommending strategies to minimize legal exposure rather than address the underlying issues. Memo litigation risk mitigation, diversity issues contain damning passages. Statistical analysis of our lending portfolio reveals significant disparities in approval rates between white and minority applicants that cannot be fully explained by credit factors. Recommend implementing cosmetic diversity initiatives while maintaining current approval metrics to create plausible deniability. This document, obtained through a subpoena of Harrington's corporate counsel, transformed the investigation from a question of unintentional disparities to one of knowing and deliberate discrimination. The legal implications were severe, potentially including both civil and criminal liability for Harrington personally and his organization more broadly. Howard Harrington was formally subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury, a development that sent shockwaves through financial markets. Harrington Financial Group's stock dropped an additional 15% on the news, bringing the total decline since the Flight 892 incident to over 40%. Institutional investors began divesting from Harrington-controlled companies, concerned about both the ethical implications and the financial risks associated with the potential regulatory penalties and legal judgments. The $300 million Asian expansion funding that Harrington had used as leverage against Atlantic Global was now in jeopardy as his own financial position weakened. The timestamp was week 3 of the federal investigation, and what had begun as a simple question about one employee's termination had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how financial power had been used to perpetuate discriminatory practices across multiple industries. Captain Marcus Reynolds' stand against Alexandra Harrington had inadvertently triggered a regulatory response that now threatened the entire foundation of Howard Harrington's business empire. In the secure conference room at the SEC, Elizabeth Chen concluded the latest coordination meeting with a reflection that captured the significance of the investigation. This case has implications far beyond one company or one billionaire. It's about whether our financial system allows powerful investors to use their economic leverage to shield discrimination from accountability. The answer to that question will affect millions of Americans across every sector of our economy. Passenger class action. In a spacious conference room at the law offices of Mendez and Associates in downtown Chicago, Rafael Mendez addressed an unprecedented gathering. 27 passengers from Flight 892 had assembled in person, with another 46 joining via video conference, to discuss the class action lawsuit they were filing against both Atlantic Global Airlines and Howard Harrington personally. The law firm's 35th floor conference room offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, the massive windows allowing natural light to flood the space. The long mahogany table was surrounded by leather chairs, with additional seating arranged along the walls for those not at the main table. Large screens displayed the faces of those participating remotely, creating a virtual extension of the physical space. What makes this case unique? Mendez explained, his measured tone reflecting his reputation as one of the nation's premier civil rights attorneys, is that we have multiple witnesses to the same discriminatory incident, all of whom were subsequently affected by the corporate response to that incident. He stood at the head of the table, his tailored suit and silver-streaked hair projecting both authority and approachability. Behind him, a digital presentation displayed key evidence and legal strategies. The lawsuit, formally titled Williams et al. Versus Atlantic Global Airlines and Harrington Financial Group, alleged that the passengers had suffered harm in multiple ways, witnessing discrimination that the airline failed to properly address, experiencing the consequences of corporate capitulation to discriminatory demands, being party to an implicit contract with the airline that was violated when stated anti-discrimination policies were not upheld, suffering financial and emotional harm due to the airline's prioritization of a discriminatory investor over passenger dignity. Nathan Williams, who had returned briefly to Chicago for the legal proceedings, sat in the front row with his attorney. As the named lead plaintiff, his testimony would be central to the case. Dr. Williams, Mendez continued, would you mind sharing with the group why you decided to initiate this action? Nathan stood, his surgical precision evident in his carefully chosen words. When my daughter and I boarded that flight, we entered into a relationship of trust with Atlantic Global Airlines. We trusted that they would transport us safely to our destination, but also that they would uphold their own stated values regarding dignity and respect for all passengers. He paused, making eye contact with several others in the room. Captain Reynolds honored that trust. The airline betrayed it when they fired him for doing exactly what their own policies required. This isn't about financial compensation for me. It's about accountability and ensuring that what happened to us doesn't happen to others in the future. Other passengers shared their experiences, each contributing a piece to the mosaic of testimony that would form the basis of the class action. An elderly woman described how Alexandra Harrington's behavior had reminded her of segregation-era discrimination she had witnessed as a child in the American South. Her voice quavered slightly as she recalled, I never thought I would see something like that again in my lifetime. It brought back memories I thought were buried. A business executive explained how the incident had forced him to reconsider his own company's approach to discrimination and corporate accountability. If Atlantic Global can fire someone for doing the right thing, what message does that send to my employees about our values? A teacher detailed how she had used the incident as a teaching moment for her students about standing up against injustice, only to have to explain why the person who did the right thing had been punished. How do I tell my students to stand up for what's right when this is what happens to people who do? A college student who had captured one of the viral videos described how Alexandra Harrington had demanded her phone be confiscated after she began recording. She said, "You can't record me without my permission." But Captain Reynolds said I had every right to document what was happening. He protected my rights too. Together, their testimonies created a powerful narrative about the real human impact of corporate decisions that prioritize financial relationships over moral principles. The legal theory underlying the class action, that passengers had suffered actual harm when Atlantic Global violated its own anti-discrimination policies, was innovative but increasingly persuasive as more passengers came forward. The airline industry operates on a foundation of public trust, Mendez explained to the assembled plaintiffs. When an airline explicitly promises a non-discriminatory environment through its published policy, then betrays that promise by punishing employees who enforce those policies, they violated the contract they established with every passenger. He turned to a slide showing Atlantic Global's own customer commitment statement, which prominently featured promises of dignity and respect for all passengers and zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. This isn't just aspirational language, Mendez continued. These are contractual promises that passengers rely on when choosing an airline. Atlantic Global's actions demonstrate that these promises are hollow, that they will sacrifice their stated values when financially convenient. The class action filing generated immediate media attention, adding another dimension to the growing pressure on Atlantic Global Airlines. The company's stock, already weakened by the controversy surrounding Reynolds' termination, dropped an additional 8% on the news of the lawsuit. Outside Mendez's office building, reporters gathered as the meeting concluded, seeking statements from the passengers involved. Dr. Williams, who had emerged as the most articulate spokesperson for the group, delivered a powerful summary of their position. This case is about more than one incident on one flight. It's about whether corporations should be held accountable for the values they claim to uphold. When Atlantic Global fired Captain Reynolds for enforcing their own anti-discrimination policies, they sent a clear message about what they truly value. We're sending a different message, that some principles are not negotiable, regardless of the financial pressures involved. The statement was broadcast on evening news programs nationwide, further shifting public sentiment against Atlantic Global and Harrington. Institutional investors began questioning the leadership of CEO Daniel Foster and the board that had approved Reynolds' termination. Atlantic Global's quarterly earnings call was dominated by questions about the company's handling of the incident, the potential financial impact of the lawsuits, and whether the board was considering leadership changes. Can you address the growing perception that Atlantic Global prioritizes relationships with wealthy investors over its own stated ethical principles? Asked one analyst from Goldman Sachs. Foster's stammering response, full of corporate platitudes about balancing multiple stakeholder interests, did nothing to reassure investors about the company's leadership. The most damaging development came when several major corporate customers announced they were suspending their business travel contracts with Atlantic Global pending resolution of the discrimination concerns. For an airline already struggling with the financial pressures created by Howard Harrington's threatened withdrawal, the loss of these corporate accounts represented an existential threat. We cannot in good conscience continue our partnership with an airline that has demonstrated such a clear disconnect between its stated values and its actions, announced the CEO of Westbrook Technologies, whose annual contract with Atlantic Global was worth over $7 million. By week 4 of the evolving controversy, Atlantic Global's board found itself in crisis. The passenger class action, combined with Reynolds' wrongful termination lawsuit and the ongoing federal investigations, created a perfect storm of legal, financial, and reputational challenges. This situation has become untenable. Board Chair Richard Thompson admitted during an emergency session, "Our stock is in free fall, corporate customers are abandoning us, and the legal exposure continues to expand. We need to reevaluate our position." The discussion that followed was contentious, with board members divided between those who advocated maintaining the current course and those who recognized the need for a dramatic change in direction. The financial realities ultimately proved decisive. Atlantic Global could not survive the combined impact of Harrington's threatened withdrawal and the customer exodus triggered by the discrimination controversy. "We have two options," Thompson summarized. "Continue defending a position that is increasingly indefensible, or acknowledge our mistake, change course, and begin rebuilding public trust." The vote was not unanimous, but clear 9-5 in favor of a fundamental change in the company's approach to the controversy. The board's decision would be implemented immediately, beginning with the removal of CEO Daniel Foster, who had been the most visible defender of Reynolds' termination. The timestamp was week 4 of the passenger class action, and what had begun as one family's experience of discrimination had evolved into a collective action that threatened the financial viability of a major airline. The passengers of Flight 892 had transformed from passive witnesses to active participants in a case that was redefining the relationship between corporate values, passenger rights, and investor influence. In his Chicago office, Rafael Mendez reviewed the latest filings in the class action, aware that the legal pressure was having its intended effect. The goal had never been to damage Atlantic Global Airlines irreparably, but to force accountability and systemic change. The board's decision suggested that this goal might be achievable without the protracted legal battle many had anticipated. Sometimes, he observed to his legal team, the most effective form of justice is the kind that prevents further harm rather than simply punishing past wrongs. If Atlantic Global emerges from this crisis with meaningful reforms, that might be the best outcome for everyone involved. Internal Harrington documents leaked 2 months after Flight 892. A plain manila envelope arrived at Olivia Jackson's office at the Wall Street Journal with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a simple note, the truth about Harrington Financial Group. Proceed with caution. The envelope sat on her desk for several minutes while Olivia contemplated its potential significance and the security implications of plugging an unknown drive into her computer. The afternoon sun slanted through her office blinds, casting striped patterns across the mysterious package. After following appropriate security protocols to verify the drive contained no malware, including having the IT department scan it on an isolated system, Olivia discovered it held over 1,700 internal documents from Harrington Financial Group spanning the past 7 years, memos, emails, meeting minutes, and strategy documents that painted a devastating picture of systematic discrimination embedded within the organization's culture and practices. The source of the leak soon became apparent: James Taylor, former executive vice president of strategy at Harrington Financial Group, who had left the company 18 months earlier under confidential circumstances. Taylor had been one of the few senior executives to challenge the company's practices from within, advocating for more inclusive hiring and lending policies. A secure message from Taylor explained his decision. After watching what happened to Captain Reynolds for standing up against discrimination, I could no longer remain silent about what I witnessed during my tenure at Harrington Financial Group. The documents I provided establish a clear pattern of discriminatory practices that were not only tolerated but actively encouraged by Howard Harrington personally. The documents revealed 3 particularly damning categories of evidence. First, internal memos showing explicit directives to limit minority representation in leadership positions. One memo from Howard Harrington himself instructed human resources to maintain appropriate demographic balance in executive roles, specifying that we must ensure our leadership reflects the values and perspective of our primary clientele. The memo went on to establish unofficial quotas, stating that minority representation at the director level should not exceed 15% to maintain our traditional corporate culture. Second, lending guidelines that created systematic disadvantages for minority applicants, including internal scoring systems that penalize addresses in predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, regardless of the applicant's financial qualifications. The Neighborhood Stability Index document explicitly downgraded properties in areas with over 30% minority residents, citing cultural compatibility concerns rather than legitimate financial risk factors. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, email threads showing how Harrington personally intervened to block or remove executives who challenged these practices, using financial leverage to pressure boards into terminating those who advocated for more inclusive policies. One particularly explicit exchange showed Harrington directing a board chairman to fire a chief diversity officer who had implemented successful recruitment initiatives. Either she goes or our investment does. Your choice, but make it by Friday. The documents provided the missing piece that investigators had been seeking: clear evidence that the discrimination was not accidental or the result of unconscious bias, but a deliberate strategy implemented from the highest levels of the organization. Before publishing, Olivia took 2 critical steps to protect both her source and the integrity of the reporting. She shared the documents with her coalition of financial journalists, allowing them to independently verify the authenticity and significance of the materials. She also provided copies to the federal agencies investigating Harrington Financial Group, ensuring that the evidence would be preserved even if legal challenges were filed to block publication. The resulting series of articles, published simultaneously across multiple major news outlets, sent shockwaves through the financial industry. Wall Street Journal, exclusive internal documents reveal Harrington's systematic discrimination directives. Bloomberg, the smoking gun, Harrington's personal orders to limit minority leadership. Financial Times, leaked memos show Harrington Financial Group's demographic balance requirements. New York Times, Howard Harrington's direct role in removing diversity advocates revealed in internal documents. The documents transformed the narrative from suggestions of potential discrimination to irrefutable evidence of deliberate exclusion directed from the highest levels of the organization. Howard Harrington's previous denials now appeared not just false, but deliberately deceptive, compounding the damage to his credibility and legal position. Most damaging was a memo written by Harrington himself following an executive's proposal to increase lending in underserved communities. We need to be realistic about risk profiles in certain neighborhoods. Our primary obligation is to our shareholders, not social engineering experiments. The executive team should focus on our core demographic rather than pursuing diversity for its own sake. The memo continued with explicit instructions. Any programs targeting minority communities should be limited to PR initiatives with minimal actual lending commitments. Maintain strict control over approval metrics to ensure these initiatives remain primarily promotional rather than operational. A Reddit thread analyzing the documents reached the front page with over 67,000 upvotes, with thousands of users collaboratively identifying additional patterns and connections that even professional journalists had missed. The online community's collective analysis identified statistical patterns in personnel decisions that strengthened the case against Harrington. The federal investigation accelerated dramatically in response to the new evidence. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division announced it was expanding its inquiry to include potential criminal violations related to lending discrimination. The SEC issued additional subpoenas focused on disclosures to investors about the company's practices and potential liabilities. Howard Harrington's initial response, a blanket denial of the document's authenticity, collapsed when multiple former executives confirmed their legitimacy. His legal team quickly pivoted to damage control, requesting private meetings with regulators to discuss potential settlements. The impact extended beyond Harrington Financial Group to the broader financial industry, where other institutions began proactive reviews of their own practices to avoid similar exposure. Industry associations issued statements reaffirming commitments to fair lending and inclusive hiring, while major banks announced new initiatives to serve historically underbanked communities. For James Taylor, the decision to become a whistleblower carried significant personal risk. Despite his careful efforts to protect his identity, Harrington's legal team quickly identified him as the likely source of the leaked documents. Cease and desist letters arrived at his home, followed by threats of litigation for alleged violations of confidentiality agreements. I understood the risks when I made this decision, Taylor explained in a secure communication with Olivia. But after watching Reynolds lose his career for standing up for what's right, I couldn't continue to protect a system that has harmed so many people. Some prices are worth paying for the truth to come out. The timestamp was month 2 of the expanding investigation into Harrington Financial Group, and what had begun as one passenger's experience of discrimination on a flight had evolved into a comprehensive examination of systemic discrimination throughout one of the nation's largest financial institutions. Captain Reynolds' stand against Alexandra Harrington had created a ripple effect that now threatened to topple an entire financial empire, built partly on discriminatory practices shielded by wealth and power. In her office at the Wall Street Journal, Olivia Jackson continued methodically analyzing the leaked documents, aware that the full implications of what they revealed would take months to fully understand and report. The story had grown far beyond what she had initially anticipated when covering a passenger incident on Flight 892. Becoming instead a watershed moment in the ongoing American conversation about race, power, and accountability. The most powerful document in the entire collection was perhaps the simplest, a handwritten note from Howard Harrington to his general counsel following an early discrimination complaint. Handle this quietly, some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. The irony was unmistakable, as those unspoken truths were now being broadcast to the world, with consequences that would reshape an industry. Part 5, The Downfall. Federal charges filed. The imposing chamber of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York fell silent as the federal prosecutor approached the podium. 3 months after Flight 892, What had begun as a passenger incident had culminated in one of the most significant financial fraud and discrimination cases in recent history. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with journalists and legal observers packed into every available seat. The high ceiling and wooden panels created a solemn atmosphere that underscored the gravity of the proceedings. Morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust particles in the air as all eyes focused on the prosecutor. The United States government is filing charges against Howard Harrington and 6 senior executives of Harrington Financial Group, announced Assistant Attorney General Melissa Rodriguez, her voice clear and deliberate. These charges include securities fraud, wire fraud, discrimination in lending practices, and obstruction of justice. The formal indictment, unsealed that morning, detailed a sweeping case against Harrington and his organization. Count 1, securities fraud, for failing to disclose material risks related to discriminatory practices to investors. Counts 2-7, wire fraud, related to electronic communications used to implement discriminatory lending policies. Counts 8-12, violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, for systematic discrimination against minority loan applicants. Counts 13-15, obstruction of justice, for attempts to conceal evidence and intimidate witnesses during federal investigations. The evidence will show that Mr. Harrington personally directed and maintained a system of discrimination throughout his organization. Rodriguez continued, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. When challenged, he used his financial power to punish those who stood against these practices, including Captain Marcus Reynolds, whose termination from Atlantic Global Airlines was directly connected to Mr. Harrington's interference. In the gallery, Marcus Reynolds sat with an attorney, watching the proceedings with a mixture of vindication and solemnity. The dark wood of the courtroom benches felt solid beneath him, a tangible reality that contrasted with the surreal nature of seeing a billionaire face accountability for actions that had upended Marcus's own career. The charges carried potential penalties of up to 30 years in prison and hundreds of millions in fines. While financial cases of this magnitude typically resulted in settlements rather than maximum sentences, the prosecution made clear that they would be seeking substantial incarceration time, given the deliberate nature of the violations and the attempts to obstruct justice. Howard Harrington himself sat at the defense table, flanked by a team of high-priced attorneys. His normally commanding presence seemed diminished in the formal setting of the courtroom, his expensive suit no longer projecting power, but instead highlighting how far he had fallen. The pallor of his skin and the tight set of his jaw revealed the strain of the proceedings. The Securities and Exchange Commission simultaneously announced civil charges against Harrington Financial Group and its leadership, seeking disgorgement of profits, civil penalties, and permanent bars from serving as officers or directors of public companies. The combined financial penalties could potentially reach billions of dollars. Market reaction was swift and severe. Harrington Financial Group's stock collapsed, losing 68% of its value in a single trading day. Trading was halted multiple times due to volatility, but each resumption brought further selling as investors rushed to distance themselves from the toxic asset. By day's end, Howard Harrington had personally lost an estimated $3.2 billion in net worth on paper. More damaging than the immediate stock collapse was the rapid client exodus. Major institutional investors began withdrawing funds from Harrington-managed accounts, unwilling to maintain relationships with a firm facing criminal charges for discriminatory practices. Corporate banking clients announced they were switching to competitors, and retail customers lined up to close accounts at Harrington-owned banks. The scene outside a Harrington Bank branch in Chicago was captured by local news cameras, dozens of customers waiting in line to close their accounts, many explicitly citing the discrimination charges as their reason for leaving. "I can't keep my money in a bank that systematically discriminated against people like me," explained one customer to a reporter. "Finding out they were actually rating my neighborhood as high risk just because of who lives here, that's not business. That's bigotry." The Federal Reserve stepped in with extraordinary measures, temporarily suspending Harrington Financial Group's banking licenses pending resolution of the criminal charges, while appointing independent monitors to oversee operations and protect depositors' funds. This regulatory intervention, while necessary to prevent a potential run on Harrington-controlled banks, effectively removed Howard Harrington from control of his own company. In a parallel development that compounded the crisis for Harrington, multiple civil rights organizations announced class action lawsuits on behalf of individuals and communities harmed by the company's discriminatory practices. These suits, building on the evidence uncovered by federal investigators and journalistic reporting, sought damages that could potentially exceed the company's remaining assets. One lawsuit represented over 7,000 minority loan applicants who had been denied credit despite qualifying under normal standards. Another represented employees who had faced discrimination in hiring and promotion. A third focused on communities that had been systematically underserved by Harrington-owned banks despite representing viable markets. Howard Harrington himself was released on $50 million bail with restrictions on his travel and financial transactions. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and bent corporate policies to his will now found himself effectively under house arrest in his Manhattan penthouse, his communications monitored and his movements restricted. A hearing was scheduled for the following week to address additional conditions, including potential asset freezes to preserve funds for victim restitution. The prosecution argued that Harrington had already attempted to move assets offshore upon learning of the investigation, necessitating immediate restrictions. The federal charges transformed the narrative completely. What Howard Harrington had initially dismissed as a minor customer service incident had escalated into criminal charges that threatened not just his wealth, but his freedom. The system of influence and intimidation that had protected him throughout his career had finally encountered a force it couldn't overcome. Federal prosecutors armed with documentary evidence of deliberate discrimination and obstruction. For Captain Marcus Reynolds, the federal charges represented a form of vindication he had never sought, but welcomed nonetheless. "This was never about me or my job," he told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "It was about standing up for basic human dignity." The charges filed today suggest that no one, regardless of their wealth or power, is above that fundamental responsibility. Atlantic Global Airlines, already facing significant financial and reputational damage from its handling of Reynolds' termination, now confronted a new crisis as a potential co-conspirator in Harrington's scheme. The leaked emails documenting how the airline had fired Reynolds under Harrington's financial pressure were cited in the federal indictment as evidence of how the billionaire had used his investment position to punish those who challenged discriminatory behavior. The airline's board, which had already begun distancing itself from Foster's leadership, now moved aggressively to position the company as a victim rather than an accomplice. Atlantic Global was manipulated by Mr. Harrington's financial leverage, the new acting CEO claimed in a hastily arranged press conference. "We are cooperating fully with federal investigators in reviewing all aspects of our relationship with Harrington Financial Group." Few were convinced by this sudden change of heart, particularly given the documented evidence of willing compliance with Harrington's demands. The airline's efforts to rehabilitate its image were further undermined when a second whistleblower from within the company revealed that executives had discussed the potential legal exposure from Reynolds' termination while proceeding anyway. The timestamp was month 3 of the evolving story, and federal prosecutors had formally transformed what began as a passenger incident into one of the most significant white-collar criminal cases in recent memory. Captain Reynolds' decision to stand against discrimination had set in motion a chain of events that now threatened to fundamentally reshape the relationship between financial power and accountability in American business. In the Department of Justice offices in Washington, the prosecutors who had assembled the case against Harrington recognized its potential significance beyond this single defendant. This case sends a message that financial power cannot shield discriminatory practices from accountability. Assistant Attorney General Rodriguez told her team, "The principles that Captain Reynolds defended on that flight are the same principles we're defending through these charges, that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their race, age, or economic status." Atlantic Global Airlines reversal. The emergency meeting of Atlantic Global Airlines Board of Directors had been in session for nearly 7 hours. The tension in the room palpable as they confronted the existential crisis facing the company. The federal indictment naming the airline as a co-conspirator in Howard Harrington's discriminatory schemes had sent the stock price into freefall, with trading halted after a 27% drop in a single session. The boardroom, with its panoramic views of Chicago now shrouded in evening darkness, felt like a bunker where desperate strategies were being formulated. Coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches littered the polished table, evidence of the marathon session that had begun mid-morning and now stretched into the night. Board members' ties had been loosened, jackets draped over chairbacks, as formality gave way to the grim reality of their situation. "The company cannot survive our current trajectory," Board Chair Richard Thompson stated bluntly. his normally composed demeanor showing clear strain. Our stock is collapsing. Corporate customers are canceling contracts, and we're facing potentially ruinous legal liability from the federal charges and passenger lawsuits. The evidence before them was stark. Since Captain Reynolds' termination 3 months earlier, stock value had declined by 43%. Erasing $3.7 billion in shareholder value, corporate travel bookings had dropped 38% as companies distanced themselves from the controversy. Employee morale had plummeted, with flight attendants and pilots wearing small blue ribbons in support of Reynolds. Consumer sentiment tracking showed the airline's reputation had suffered the steepest decline in the industry's history. Legal expenses related to the various lawsuits had already exceeded $12 million with no resolution in sight. "We made a catastrophic error in judgment," admitted board member Jennifer Martinez, who had initially voted to terminate Reynolds. "We prioritized a financial relationship with Harrington over our own stated values, and it has backfired spectacularly." The federal indictment had been particularly damaging, as it included explicit quotes from internal communications showing that airline executives had knowingly violated their own policies to appease Harrington. The document cited the airline's published commitment to anti-discrimination alongside its contradictory actions, highlighting the hypocrisy in stark legal terms. After hours of deliberation, the board reached a unanimous decision: CEO Daniel Foster would be removed immediately, and the company would execute a complete reversal of its position regarding Captain Reynolds. Patricia Morgan, who had consistently opposed Reynolds' termination, was named interim CEO with a mandate to rebuild the airline's reputation and address the legal and financial challenges it faced. The public announcement came the following morning in the form of a full-page advertisement in major newspapers nationwide and a comprehensive digital campaign. Atlantic Global Airlines acknowledges that we failed to uphold our core values in our handling of the incident on Flight 892. Captain Marcus Reynolds acted with integrity and in accordance with our anti-discrimination policies when he stood up for the dignity of all passengers. Our decision to terminate his employment was wrong, and we accept full responsibility for that error in judgment. Effective immediately, we are implementing the following changes. We have offered Captain Reynolds full reinstatement with back pay, promotion to senior captain, and an unconditional public apology. We are establishing the Reynolds Dignity Initiative, a comprehensive training program for all employees focused on upholding human dignity in every aspect of our operations. We have severed all financial relationships with Harrington Financial Group and its subsidiaries. Our board has approved a settlement with the passengers of Flight 892 that includes both financial compensation and structural changes to our policies regarding discrimination incidents. We are cooperating fully with federal investigators regarding the improper influence exerted by Howard Harrington over our personnel decisions. Atlantic Global Airlines is committed to earning back the trust of our customers, employees, and shareholders by demonstrating through actions, not just words, that we genuinely value dignity and respect for all people. The announcement was signed by the entire board of directors, a symbolic acknowledgement of collective responsibility for the company's previous failures. The public response was cautiously positive, with civil rights organizations acknowledging the steps as meaningful, but emphasizing that the company's future actions would be the true test of its commitment. Financial markets responded more enthusiastically, with the stock recovering 15% of its losses as investors recognized the potential for the company to rebuild its reputation and customer base. Social media reactions were mixed, with hashtags like #TooLittleTooLate competing with #ComebackStory. A popular TikTok video showed a flight attendant reacting to the announcement: "When your company finally does the right thing, but only after losing billions, #BetterLateThanNever, #Atlantic Global Drama." For Marcus Reynolds, the reinstatement offer came during a private meeting with Richard Thompson and Patricia Morgan, who had consistently defended him throughout the controversy. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a small conference room at his attorney's office rather than airline headquarters, a subtle acknowledgement of the power dynamics at play. "We failed you, Marcus," Thompson acknowledged frankly, making no attempt to soften the admission with corporate language. "More importantly, we failed our own principles. The offer of reinstatement comes with no conditions, no NDA, no restrictions on discussing what happened. You've earned the right to tell your story however you see fit." Marcus considered the offer carefully, his expression revealing nothing of his internal deliberations. The past 3 months had been a roller coaster of public support and private anxiety, of legal battles and financial uncertainty. Now, the company that had discarded him was asking him to return. I appreciate the acknowledgement in the offer, but my return would need to mean something beyond symbolic amends. I'd want to help build something positive from this experience. Patricia nodded, having anticipated this response. That's exactly what we hoped. The Reynolds Dignity Initiative isn't just a name. We want you to help design it, to ensure it has real substance rather than just being a PR exercise. The discussion continued for several hours, with Marcus outlining his vision for how the airline could transform its approach to leadership, dignity, and ethical decision-making at all levels. By the end of the meeting, a framework had been established that went far beyond his personal reinstatement to address systematic changes throughout the organization. The settlement with the passengers of Flight 892, negotiated through Rafael Mendez, was similarly substantial. Beyond financial compensation, it established an independent oversight board with passenger representatives to review the airline's handling of discrimination incidents and make binding recommendations for policy improvements. Most significant was the company's decision to publicly disclose the details of Howard Harrington's financial pressure and how it had influenced the decision to terminate Reynolds. This transparency, while legally risky, sent a powerful message about the company's commitment to accountability and its rejection of the dynamics that had led to the crisis. The federal prosecutors handling the case against Harrington Financial Group acknowledged Atlantic Global's cooperation in a public statement. While the airline's initial handling of this matter was deeply problematic, their subsequent transparency and cooperation have provided valuable evidence regarding the methods used by Mr. Harrington to influence corporate behavior. This cooperation will be considered as the case proceeds. This carefully worded statement suggested that the airline might avoid the most severe penalties if it continued to assist in the case against Harrington, providing a potential path forward from what had seemed like an insurmountable legal challenge. The timestamp was month 3 of the evolving story, and Atlantic Global Airlines had executed one of the most dramatic corporate reversals in recent business history. What had begun as a passenger incident had forced a fundamental reassessment of the company's values, governance, and relationship with powerful investors. In the boardroom after the public announcement, Patricia Morgan reflected on the transformation they had witnessed. 3 months ago, we sacrificed principle for expedience and a valued employee for financial convenience. The cost of that decision has been enormous in every way. The lesson here isn't just about discrimination or investor influence, it's about whether we actually believe in the values we claim to uphold. The coming months would determine whether the airline's reversal represented a genuine transformation or merely a strategic retreat in the face of financial pressure. But the immediate impact was clear. A corporate culture that had prioritized powerful investors over its own stated principles had been forced to reckon with the consequences of that choice, not just in terms of reputation, but in the hard currency of stock value, customer relationships, and legal liability. For an industry that had often treated anti-discrimination policies as marketing materials rather than operational commitments, the message was unmistakable in an era of ubiquitous video recording and social media accountability. The cost of betraying stated values had risen dramatically, potentially to the point of corporate existential threat. The Harrington empire collapses. 4 months after Alexandra Harrington's confrontation with Dr. Williams and Zoe on Flight 892, the financial empire her husband had spent decades building was disintegrating with breathtaking speed. What Howard Harrington had once dismissed as a minor customer service incident had triggered a cascade of consequences that now threatened everything he had built. The headquarters of Harrington Financial Group in Midtown Manhattan, once a symbol of power and prestige, now resembled a fortress under siege. Security personnel monitored the entrances as federal agents executed search warrants, carrying out boxes of documents and electronic devices. The glass and steel building that had once projected confidence and permanence now felt like a monument to a collapsing dynasty. Employees watched nervously from behind plate glass windows, many already updating their resumes as the company's future grew increasingly uncertain. The palpable anxiety contrasted sharply with the building's opulent lobby, where marble floors and abstract sculptures seemed increasingly disconnected from the financial reality. Inside, the executive floor that had once buzzed with activity was eerily quiet. Howard Harrington's corner office remained locked, his personal items still in place, but untouched since federal prosecutors had restricted his access to company operations as a condition of his bail. The financial collapse had accelerated beyond what even the most pessimistic analysts had predicted. Harrington Financial Group's stock had lost 82% of its value since the federal charges were announced, reducing its market capitalization from $17 billion to under $3 billion. Assets under management had declined from $17 billion to under $4 billion as clients fled, withdrawing funds at a rate that threatened liquidity in several divisions. The company's credit rating had been downgraded to junk status, making it virtually impossible to secure the financing needed to maintain operations. Regulatory restrictions had effectively frozen most of the firm's banking and investment activities pending resolution of the criminal charges. The board of directors, once populated by Harrington loyalists, had been reconstituted under regulatory pressure. The new board, led by independent directors with backgrounds in corporate governance and ethics, faced the grim task of determining whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. Based on our analysis, the company cannot continue as a going concern under its current structure, reported the newly appointed CEO, Sarah Mitchell, who had been brought in from outside to manage the crisis. The conference room where she delivered this assessment was the same one where Howard Harrington had once imperiously directed his financial empire. The legal liabilities alone exceed our remaining unencumbered assets, and the reputational damage has made it impossible to retain clients or attract new business. The board reluctantly approved the inevitable next step. Harrington Financial Group would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, seeking to reorganize its assets and liabilities under court supervision. This extraordinary step for a financial institution reflected the severity of the crisis and the recognition that the company could not survive in its current form. The bankruptcy filing, when it came, revealed the full extent of the disaster. Assets that had once been valued at over $17 billion were now estimated at less than $5 billion, while liabilities, including potential settlements from discrimination lawsuits, potentially exceeded $8 billion. Thousands of employees faced uncertain futures as the company prepared for significant downsizing and possible liquidation of many operations. The Wall Street Journal's headline captured the historic nature of the collapse. Harrington Financial Group files, largest discrimination-driven bankruptcy in human history. For Howard Harrington personally, the financial collapse was accompanied by mounting legal peril. Federal prosecutors, armed with evidence from the leaked internal documents and testimony from former executives, continued to build their criminal case. Each new revelation seemed to strengthen the government's position, with emails and memos directly connecting Harrington to the discriminatory practices at the heart of the charges. The final blow to any hope of salvaging his reputation or fortune came when 3 former members of his executive team agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Their testimony provided firsthand accounts of how Harrington had personally directed discriminatory policies and used his financial leverage to punish those who challenged these practices. Mr. Harrington explicitly told us to maintain what he called demographic balance in leadership roles, testified former Chief Operating Officer Robert Davis. He made it clear that he wanted the executive team to remain predominantly white, and he personally reviewed diversity statistics to ensure they didn't exceed his preferred thresholds. Another former executive, Jennifer Torres, testified about Harrington's direct role in removing employees who challenged discriminatory practices. He would call board members personally when he felt someone was pushing too hard on diversity initiatives. He referred to these employees as cultural disruptors and made it clear they should be terminated regardless of their performance. As Harrington's legal position deteriorated, his personal behavior grew increasingly erratic. Despite bail conditions restricting his movements, he attempted to board his private jet at Teterboro Airport with luggage containing over $4 million in cash and bearer bonds. Airport security, alerted by federal monitors tracking his movements, detained him before takeoff. The New York Post front page captured the moment with the headline, "Flight Risk Billionaire Busted Trying to Flee with Millions." This attempted flight led to his bail being revoked, and Howard Harrington, who had once commanded boardrooms and bent corporate America to his will, was remanded to federal custody pending trial. The image of the 65-year-old billionaire in handcuffs, being escorted into the Metropolitan Detention Center, became the defining symbol of his fall from power. Alexandra Harrington, whose confrontation with Dr. Williams and Zoe had initiated the entire chain of events, experienced her own public meltdown. Confronted by reporters outside their Manhattan apartment building, She launched into a tirade that was captured on video and quickly went viral. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she shouted at the assembled media, mascara streaking down her face as she gestured wildly. "One little juice spill, and you've destroyed an empire that pilot should have known his place. And now look what's happened." The video, with its unfiltered display of entitlement and thinly veiled racist undertones, only reinforced the public perception that had driven the Harringtons' downfall, a belief that they had considered themselves above the basic standards of dignity and respect that should apply to all people. A TikTok edit of her meltdown reached 7.3 million views with the caption, "When you blame a child's juice spill for exposing your husband's entire discriminatory empire, hashtag Karen of the Year, hashtag Harrington Meltdown." The timestamp was month 4 of the unfolding story, and the collapse of Harrington Financial Group had become a cautionary tale taught in business schools nationwide. What had begun as a confrontation over a juice spill had exposed the fragility of power built on discrimination and intimidation. In federal custody awaiting trial, Howard Harrington finally confronted a reality he had spent his career avoiding, that his wealth and influence had limits, and that some principles were truly non-negotiable, regardless of one's financial resources. The man who had threatened Captain Reynolds' career for standing up against discrimination now faced the prospect of spending his remaining years in federal prison, his reputation destroyed and his financial empire in ruins. The Harrington case represented a watershed moment in corporate America's approach to discrimination and accountability. CEOs and boards across industries studied the collapse, recognizing that in an era of ubiquitous recording and social media amplification, no amount of financial power could shield organizations from the consequences of betraying fundamental principles of human dignity. A Harvard Business Review article analyzing the collapse concluded, "The Harrington case demonstrates that discriminatory practices are not just moral failings, but existential business risks. When exposed to full public scrutiny, systems of exclusion and privilege that may have operated quietly for decades can collapse with remarkable speed, destroying shareholder value and ending careers in the process." Reynolds' vindication. 5 months after his stand on Flight 892, Captain Marcus Reynolds stood before a packed auditorium at Atlantic Global Airlines Training Center, now wearing the 4 stripes of his new position as Director of Flight Operations. The journey from termination to vindication had been longer and more public than he could have ever anticipated, but the principles that had guided his decision remained unchanged. The auditorium buzzed with energy, filled to capacity with pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and corporate staff. The space that had once hosted routine safety briefings and corporate announcements now felt charged with significance. Light from overhead projectors cast Marcus's shadow large against the presentation screen as he prepared to address the assembly. "Leadership isn't about rank or authority," he told the assembled pilots, many wearing the small blue ribbons that had become a symbol of support during his termination. "It's about having the moral courage to do what's right, especially when doing so comes with personal risk." His voice carried throughout the room without need of amplification, a natural authority that had been reinforced rather than diminished by his ordeal. Marcus's reinstatement had come with full back pay, public apologies from the airline's leadership, and a promotion that gave him oversight of training and operational standards across the entire fleet. More significantly, it had come with a mandate to implement the Reynolds Dignity Initiative, a comprehensive approach to ethical leadership that was transforming the airline's culture from within. The congressional testimony he had delivered the previous week had elevated his message to a national platform. Appearing before the House Committee on Transportation and Ethics, Marcus had spoken not about his personal experience, but about the broader implications for corporate America. "What happened on Flight 892 wasn't unique," he had testified. The crowded hearing room hushed as he spoke. "The only unusual aspect was that it happened in public, with multiple witnesses and video evidence. Similar choices between principle and expediency occur every day throughout corporate America, most hidden from public view. The question before us is not just how we handled one incident, but what values we want to guide our organizations when no one is watching." C-SPAN footage of his testimony had been viewed over 3 million times, far beyond the audience for typical congressional hearings. His measured responses to pointed questions from representatives on both sides of the aisle had earned praise for their clarity and conviction. His testimony had resonated far beyond the hearing room, sparking discussions across industries about the relationship between stated corporate values and actual decision-making when those values are tested. Business schools had incorporated the Reynolds case into their ethics curricula, examining how financial pressure from powerful investors had influenced Atlantic Global's initial decision to terminate him. In the airline's operations center, Marcus had found an ally in First Officer Miguel Hernandez, whose initial silence during the Flight 892 incident had been followed by a courageous decision to recant his forced testimony during the investigation. Their partnership in developing new training protocols for ethical decision-making had helped heal the rift that had initially formed between them. "I owe you an apology, Marcus," Miguel had said during their first meeting after Reynolds' reinstatement. "I should have supported you on the flight, and I shouldn't have allowed myself to be pressured during the investigation." "We all make choices under pressure," Marcus had replied, the corner of his mouth lifting in a slight smile. "What matters is that when you recognized the wrong choice, you had the courage to correct it. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need to build here." The pilots in today's training session represented the first cohort to go through the new ethical leadership program that Marcus and Miguel had developed together. The curriculum went beyond traditional CRM crew resource management to address the complex ethical dilemmas that aviation professionals might face throughout their careers. "Your technical skills as pilots are essential," Marcus explained to the group, "but equally important is your moral compass, your ability to recognize when something is wrong, and your courage to address it, even when doing so might be professionally inconvenient." As he spoke, Marcus noticed Patricia Morgan, now promoted to Executive Vice President of Operations, entering the back of the auditorium. She had been his most consistent ally throughout the ordeal, risking her own career to defend his actions when most of the executive team had capitulated to Harrington's pressure. After the session concluded and the pilots had dispersed, Patricia approached with news that added another dimension to Marcus's vindication. "The board approved it this morning," she said, handing him a press release draft. "The Atlantic Global Foundation is establishing the Reynolds Scholarship for Ethical Leadership, full ride for 10 students per year from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation." Marcus read the document, momentarily overwhelmed by the implications. "This is significant." "It's necessary," Patricia corrected him. "What happened to you should never happen again, and the best way to ensure that is to build a pipeline of leaders who share your commitment to doing the right thing, regardless of pressure." Later that afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visitor in his office, First Officer James Wilson from another major airline, who had been vocal in criticizing Reynolds' actions during the initial controversy. Wilson had characterized the removal of Alexandra Harrington as unnecessary virtue signaling and prioritizing political correctness over operational efficiency. The man who now stood in Marcus's doorway looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he gathered the courage to speak. "I was wrong," Wilson admitted, clearly struggling with the acknowledgement. "I bought into the narrative that you were overreacting, that there were less disruptive ways to handle the situation. But after seeing the evidence that emerged during the federal investigation, it's clear you did exactly what any responsible captain should have done." "We all have learning moments," Marcus replied, extending his hand. "The important thing is to grow from them." The timestamp was month 5 of the journey that had begun with a simple stand for human dignity on Flight 892. Marcus Reynolds had lost his job, faced public scrutiny, and endured financial uncertainty, only to emerge with his principles intact and his platform for positive change significantly expanded. In his office that evening, reviewing materials for the next day's training session, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed a routine flight into a national conversation about moral courage and corporate ethics. He had never sought to become a symbol or to challenge a billionaire's power. He had simply made the decision that his responsibility as captain included ensuring the dignity of every person on his aircraft. That decision, made in a moment of clarity amid the pressure of command, had rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated, ultimately transforming not just his own career, but an entire industry's approach to discrimination and accountability. The vindication he felt was not merely personal, but reflected a broader affirmation that some values truly were non-negotiable, regardless of the financial pressures that might be brought to bear against them. Industry transformation. 1 year after Flight 892, the impact of what had become known as the Reynolds Protocol extended far beyond Atlantic Global Airlines. What had begun as one captain's stand against discrimination had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of how the transportation industry addressed issues of dignity, ethics, and accountability. The American Association of Airlines, the industry's primary trade organization, had adopted comprehensive new standards for handling discrimination incidents, with specific protocols for empowering crew members to intervene when passenger dignity was threatened. These standards, developed with input from civil rights organizations and passenger advocacy groups, represented a significant shift from previous approaches that had often prioritized conflict avoidance over confronting discriminatory behavior. The Reynolds Protocol fundamentally changed our industry's approach to these issues, explained AAA President Rebecca Johnson during a panel discussion at the International Aviation Conference. Before Flight 892, many airlines treated anti-discrimination policies as public relations statements rather than operational imperatives. Today, they're embedded in our training, our procedures, and our organizational values in ways that have measurable impact. The impact was indeed measurable. In the years since the protocol's adoption, reported incidents of discriminatory behavior on flights had decreased by 37%. As passengers became aware that such behavior would not be tolerated, passenger satisfaction scores related to respect and dignity had increased across all demographic groups. With particularly significant improvements among minority travelers, employee surveys showed significantly higher confidence in company support when addressing discrimination, with 84% of crew members reporting they felt empowered to intervene when necessary. Legal claims related to airlines' handling of discriminatory incidents had declined by 42%. As prompt and appropriate responses prevented escalation. Beyond statistics, the transformation was evident in the stories emerging from the industry. Flight attendants who intervened decisively when passengers made racist comments, captains who delayed departures to ensure discriminatory situations were properly resolved, and corporate leadership that consistently prioritized dignity over schedule efficiency or passenger status. What we've learned, Johnson continued, is that doing the right thing isn't just ethically sound, it's good business. The airlines that have most fully embraced the Reynolds Protocol have seen the greatest improvements in customer loyalty, employee satisfaction, and even operational metrics. The protocol had spread beyond airlines to adjacent industries. Cruise lines, passenger rail services, and hotel chains had all developed similar approaches. Recognizing that in an era of ubiquitous recording and social media amplification, the financial and reputational risks of failing to address discrimination far outweighed the costs of potential delays or customer complaints. For Alexandra Harrington, the aftermath of her behavior on Flight 892 had included both legal consequences and mandatory education. As part of her settlement with Dr. Williams and Atlantic Global, she had been required to complete 500 hours of community service working with underserved communities and to participate in an intensive bias awareness program. Her public statements following the completion of this program suggested at least some degree of reflection and growth. I never saw myself as someone who would discriminate against others. She acknowledged in a written statement, "The events on Flight 892 forced me to confront aspects of my thinking and behavior that I had never examined. While I cannot undo the harm my actions caused, I am committed to the ongoing work of recognizing and addressing my own biases." Media coverage of Alexandra's community service showed her working alongside diverse populations in settings far removed from her previous life of privilege. Whether this represented genuine transformation or simply compliance with legal requirements remained an open question. But the visual of a former socialite serving meals at a community kitchen created its own powerful narrative about accountability. Howard Harrington's legal situation had continued to deteriorate throughout the year. After multiple unsuccessful attempts to have the charges dismissed or reduced, he had finally agreed to a plea agreement with the federal prosecutors. The terms were severe, but it reflected the seriousness of the evidence against him. Guilty pleas to securities fraud and violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, a 12-year prison sentence at a federal correctional institution, forfeiture of $1.7 billion in assets derived from fraudulent activities, a lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company, establishment of a $500 million restitution fund for victims of discriminatory lending practices. The sentencing judge had been unsparing in his assessment. "Mr. Harrington, you used your financial power not just to enrich yourself, which is the typical motivation in financial fraud cases, but to systematically disadvantage others based on their race, and to punish those who stood against such discrimination. This represents a particularly egregious breach of both legal and moral obligations. The business media extensively analyzed Harrington's downfall, with the Financial Times publishing a comprehensive case study titled "From Billions to Bankruptcy: How Discrimination Destroyed a Financial Empire." The article traced how practices that had once been shielded by wealth and influence had collapsed when exposed to public scrutiny, creating a cautionary tale about the business risks of systemic discrimination. For Dr. Nathan Williams and Zoe, life had settled into a new normal in London. The fellowship at Royal Children's Hospital had proven even more rewarding than anticipated, with Nathan's innovative microsurgical techniques saving the lives of children who might otherwise have had no options. Zoe, now 9 years old, had adapted well to her new school and made friends from diverse backgrounds. The stuffed pilot bear, Captain, still occupied a place of honor on her bed, alongside Rex the dinosaur. When asked by a visiting journalist about her memories of Flight 892, her response reflected the resilience of childhood. "It was scary when the lady was mean to us, but then the captain helped us. That's what grown-ups are supposed to do." Her simple articulation of moral responsibility had been quoted in numerous articles about the incident, cutting through complex ethical discussions to the essential truth at the heart of the story. The timestamp was 1 year later, and the transformation triggered by Captain Marcus Reynolds' stand against discrimination had become embedded in policies, procedures, and cultural expectations across the transportation industry. What had begun as a confrontation over a juice spill had evolved into a case study in how individual moral courage could catalyze systemic change. At Atlantic Global Airlines, the Reynolds Dignity Initiative had become the centerpiece of the company's rebuilding efforts. The airline, once facing potential financial ruin from the controversy, had gradually restored its reputation and customer base by demonstrating an authentic commitment to the values it claimed to uphold. The federal regulations governing passenger rights had been updated to include stronger protections against discrimination, with specific requirements for how airlines must respond to such incidents. These regulatory changes, informally known as Reynolds Rules, ensured that the transformation would continue regardless of individual corporate priorities or leadership changes. In business schools nationwide, the Reynolds case had become a standard part of ethics curricula, examining the tensions between financial pressure and moral principle, and the real costs, both financial and reputational, of sacrificing values for expediency. The impact extended to corporate governance more broadly, with shareholders increasingly demanding that boards demonstrate real commitment to stated values rather than merely publishing aspirational statements about diversity and inclusion. The collapse of Harrington Financial Group had become a cautionary tale of what could happen when a disconnection between stated values and actual behavior became publicly exposed. For Captain Marcus Reynolds, now overseeing the implementation of the protocol that bore his name across multiple airlines, the most meaningful validation came not from industry recognition or professional advancement, but from the knowledge that his stand had made a tangible difference in how people were treated. The principles of dignity and respect that had guided his decision on Flight 892 had rippled outward, transforming not just one flight or one airline, but an entire industry's approach to the fundamental question of how we treat one another when conflict arises. Part 6 Epilogue. 3 years later, Captain Marcus Reynolds stood at the podium in Atlantic Global's newly constructed training academy, surveying the diverse group of pilots, flight attendants, and operational staff gathered for the annual Dignity and Leadership Symposium. At 55, his hair had a bit more gray than when he had made his stand on Flight 892, but his bearing still reflected the quiet authority that had defined his career. The modern facility, with its state-of-the-art simulators and training spaces, had been designed to embody the airline's renewed commitment to excellence and ethical leadership. Natural light flooded the auditorium through expansive windows, symbolizing the transparency that had become central to the company's rebuilt culture. Subtle blue ribbons, the symbol that had once represented support for Reynolds during his termination, were now incorporated into the Academy's official design elements. 3 years ago, none of us could have predicted where that moment would lead, he began, his voice carrying easily through the state-of-the-art auditorium named in his honor. What began as a simple decision to uphold a passenger's dignity has transformed not just our airline, but our entire industry's approach to the fundamental values that should guide our operations. As Senior Vice President of Operations and Safety, Marcus now oversaw training programs that had been adopted by 17 airlines worldwide. The Reynolds Protocol, initially developed for Atlantic Global, had evolved into an industry-wide standard for addressing discrimination and ethical challenges throughout commercial aviation. The transformation was evident in Atlantic Global's own statistics. Customer satisfaction scores had reached their highest levels in the company's history, with particular strength in measures of inclusive service. Employee retention had improved by 27%, with particular gains among diverse staff who reported feeling truly valued. Discrimination incidents had decreased by 64% since implementing comprehensive training that empowered all staff to intervene when necessary. The airline had been recognized with the Industry Leadership Award for Inclusive Excellence for 3 consecutive years. Beyond the numbers, the cultural shift was palpable. Crew members regularly reported feeling empowered to address problematic behavior, regardless of a passenger's status or connections. Corporate leadership consistently supported these interventions, recognizing that maintaining dignity for all passengers was both an ethical imperative and a business advantage. After the morning keynote, Marcus met privately with 2 special visitors who had flown in for the event, Dr. Nathan Williams and his daughter Zoe, now 11, who had returned to Chicago for a medical conference where Nathan was presenting his research findings. The meeting took place in a small garden courtyard at the center of the training complex, a peaceful space designed for reflection. The sound of a small fountain created a soothing backdrop as they reconnected for the first time in nearly 2 years. Dr. Williams, Marcus greeted him warmly. "It's good to see you again. And Zoe, you've grown so much since we last met." Zoe, more confident than the frightened 8-year-old from Flight 892, smiled and presented Marcus with a drawing she had created for the occasion. It showed an airplane with diverse passengers and crew, with the words "Dignity for Everyone" written across the top in careful lettering. "I joined the Young Aviators program at school," she announced proudly. "I want to be a pilot like you someday." Nathan smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. "The fellowship in London has been even more successful than I anticipated. We're returning to Chicago permanently next month. I've accepted a position heading the pediatric neurosurgery department at Northwestern." "That's wonderful news," Marcus replied. "And perfect timing. Actually, we're launching a partnership with Chicago area schools to introduce aviation careers to underrepresented students. Having Zoe participate would be meaningful, given her connection to how this all began." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carmen Diaz, now director of cabin crew training, whose courageous testimony during the investigation had played a crucial role in exposing the truth about Reynolds' termination. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but the media is waiting for the panel discussion, and I thought you might want a moment to prepare." The panel, featuring Marcus, Carmen, and several other key figures from the Flight 892 story, had become an annual tradition, a way to ensure that the lessons learned were not forgotten as time passed and new employees joined the company. First Officer Miguel Hernandez, who had initially remained silent during the crucial moment on Flight 892, but later found the courage to speak truth during the investigation, was now a training captain himself. His particular focus was helping newer pilots navigate the complex intersection of technical authority and moral responsibility that defined command. "The hardest lesson I learned," Miguel often told his trainees, "was that silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of action. When I failed to support Captain Reynolds in that crucial moment, I became complicit in what followed." This emphasis on moral courage rather than mere technical proficiency had transformed Atlantic Global's approach to leadership development throughout the organization. Where previous training had focused primarily on procedures and regulations, the new curriculum explicitly addressed the ethical dimensions of aviation leadership, the responsibility to ensure not just the physical safety of passengers, but their dignity as well. The timestamp was 3 years later, and the ripple effects from Flight 892 continued to expand through the industry and beyond. The Reynolds Protocol had been adapted for use in healthcare settings, educational institutions, and corporate environments, each recognizing that clear guidelines for addressing discrimination were essential in creating truly inclusive spaces. For Marcus Reynolds, the most meaningful legacy wasn't the protocol that bore his name or his expanded role within the airline. It was the knowledge that his decision on that flight had helped create an environment where dignity was not just a word in a corporate mission statement, but a lived reality for employees and passengers alike. The principles that had guided him in that crucial moment, that everyone deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of age, race, or economic status, had proven more powerful and more durable than the financial threats that Howard Harrington had wielded against him. The stand he had taken for Zoe Williams' dignity had ultimately transformed not just one flight or one airline, but an entire industry's approach to the fundamental question of how we treat one another when our values are tested. The legacy. The PBS documentary Principles in the Sky had exceeded all expectations, becoming the most watched program in the public broadcasting network's business ethics series. Through interviews with everyone from passengers on Flight 892 to industry executives and regulatory officials, the film chronicled how a single moment of moral courage had catalyzed a transformation that extended far beyond one airline or one incident. "What makes the Reynolds case so compelling?" explained the narrator over footage of Captain Reynolds addressing a community youth aviation program, "is that it represents the rare instance where standing on principle ultimately created more positive change than compromise would have. While Reynolds initially lost his job for doing the right thing, the long-term impact of his decision transformed not just his own career trajectory, but an entire industry's approach to ethical leadership." The documentary's final segment explored the broader societal impact that had emerged from Flight 892, examining how the case had influenced everything from corporate governance to civil rights enforcement to business school curricula nationwide. Howard Harrington, now serving his 12-year sentence at a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania, had declined to be interviewed for the film. His absence was filled by financial experts and former employees who provided context for how his discriminatory practices had been shielded by wealth and power for decades before Reynolds' stand inadvertently exposed the entire system. Footage of the once imposing Harrington Financial Group headquarters, now occupied by multiple tenants after the bankruptcy sale, served as a visual metaphor for the collapse of an empire built partly on exclusion and privilege. Alexandra Harrington, having completed her community service requirements and bias awareness training, had made a brief statement acknowledging her behavior on the flight and expressing regret for her actions. While skeptics questioned the sincerity of her transformation, the educational foundation she had subsequently established to support diversity in aviation suggested at least some degree of genuine reflection. In his Chicago office at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Dr. Nathan Williams paused the documentary he was rewatching to answer a call from the Young Aviators Program Coordinator. Zoe's application for the advanced track had been accepted, moving her one step closer to her dream of becoming a pilot. The journey that had begun with a simple juice spill and an adult's disproportionate reaction had transformed into a source of inspiration for his daughter's future. Marcus Reynolds' community work had expanded far beyond aviation. The nonprofit organization he had established with part of his settlement from Atlantic Global, Dignity Through Leadership, now worked with underprivileged youth across the country, using his story as a framework for teaching moral courage and ethical decision-making in challenging circumstances. Leadership isn't about rank or title, he explained to a group of teenagers at a Southside Chicago community center. It's about having the clarity to recognize what's right and the courage to stand for it, especially when there's pressure to look away. The teenagers, many from backgrounds where authority figures had often failed them, were initially skeptical of this message. But as Marcus shared the details of his own journey, including the very real fear of losing his career and financial security, they began to engage with the core question that had defined his experience. What would you do if standing for what's right might cost you everything you've worked for? Federal aviation regulations had been permanently changed in response to the case, with new requirements for how airlines must handle discrimination incidents and protect employees who intervene in such situations. These regulations, formally titled Passenger Dignity Assurance Standards, but commonly known as Reynolds Rules, ensured that the industry transformation would continue regardless of individual corporate priorities or leadership changes. The financial industry had experienced its own transformation in the wake of Harrington Financial Group's collapse. The Securities and Exchange Commission had implemented new disclosure requirements regarding diversity practices and discrimination risks. Recognizing that such issues represented material financial information that investors had a right to know, banking regulators had strengthened fair lending enforcement, with particular focus on the kinds of systematic discrimination that had been documented in the Harrington case. Perhaps most significantly, The public conversation about corporate values had shifted from aspirational statements to accountable actions. Shareholders increasingly demanded evidence that companies were living their stated principles rather than merely publishing them in annual reports. The Harrington lesson, as it became known in corporate governance circles, was that the gap between proclaimed values and actual behavior represented a significant risk that could no longer be managed through public relations alone. The legacy of Flight 892 extended even to elementary school classrooms, where a children's book titled Captain Stands Tall had been incorporated into character education programs nationwide. The simplified story, following a pilot who protects a child from bullying despite pressure from powerful adults, had become a way to introduce young children to concepts of moral courage and standing up for others. The timestamp was the legacy, and what had begun as one passenger's experience of discrimination had evolved into a multifaceted transformation of how institutions approach questions of dignity, accountability, and moral leadership. Captain Marcus Reynolds had never sought to become a symbol or create a movement, but his decision in that crucial moment had resonated because it reflected values that most people recognized as fundamental to human dignity, regardless of their political perspectives or personal backgrounds. The principles at stake on Flight 892, that everyone deserves to be treated with respect regardless of age, race, or economic status, had proven more powerful and more durable than the financial threats that Howard Harrington had wielded against them. The stand that Reynolds had taken for Zoe Williams' dignity had ultimately transformed not just one flight or one airline, but the relationship between corporate power, individual conscience, and collective accountability throughout American business. Final message: as Marcus Reynolds walked through Terminal 3 at O'Hare International Airport, now named the Captain Marcus Reynolds Terminal in recognition of his contribution to aviation ethics, he paused to read a personal letter that had arrived that morning from Zoe Williams. Now in her first year of formal flight training at 11 years old, she had written to share her progress and express a perspective that only someone who had been at the center of the Flight 892 incident could offer. Dear Captain Marcus, the letter began in careful handwriting. Yesterday, my flight instructor let me take the controls of a real airplane for the first time. When I was feeling nervous, I remembered what you did for me on that flight 3 years ago, and it helped me be brave. Dad says that sometimes the most important moments don't seem big when they're happening, but they change everything that comes after. I think he's right. Marcus smiled at the simplicity and wisdom of the observation. The moment he had decided to intervene on Flight 892 hadn't felt like a historical turning point or the beginning of a movement. It had simply been about doing what his responsibility as captain required, ensuring that every person on his aircraft was treated with dignity, regardless of their age, race, or economic status. Yet that single decision, made in a moment of clarity amid the pressures of command, had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. It had exposed discriminatory practices that had been shielded by wealth and power for decades. It had transformed how an entire industry approached questions of leadership and accountability. It had even inspired an 11-year-old girl to pursue her own journey into aviation, carrying forward the lessons about dignity and courage that she had witnessed firsthand. As he continued through the terminal toward his gate, Marcus reflected on the question he was most frequently asked during interviews and speaking engagements. Would you make the same decision again, knowing what it would cost you? His answer never varied. The principles that guided that decision weren't situational. They were fundamental. Treating people with dignity isn't something you do when it's convenient. It's something you do because it's right. And in the long run, standing for what's right is never truly costly, even when it comes with temporary setbacks. What Marcus couldn't have known in that crucial moment on Flight 892 was that his stand would catalyze a transformation that extended far beyond one flight, one airline, or even one industry. The ripple effects had reached into corporate boardrooms, regulatory agencies, educational institutions, and even children's classrooms, changing how people thought about the relationship between power, principle, and accountability. Howard Harrington, once one of the most powerful men in American finance, now served his sentence in federal prison, his empire dismantled and his reputation destroyed. Alexandra Harrington, whose contemptuous treatment of a child had initiated the entire chain of events, had been forced to confront the consequences of her behavior in ways that wealth and privilege had previously shielded her from experiencing. Yet the story's lasting significance wasn't about retribution or downfall. It was about transformation and growth. Atlantic Global Airlines had emerged from the crisis as an industry leader in ethical practices and inclusive culture. Marcus himself had found a platform for positive change far broader than his previous role as a captain. Even the Harringtons, despite the severe consequences they had faced, had been given opportunities for reflection and redemption that might ultimately lead to genuine growth. The timestamp was today. The journey continues. And the message that had emerged from Flight 892 continued to resonate because it reflected a truth that transcended the specific circumstances of that incident, that moral courage matters, that dignity is non-negotiable, and that standing for these principles can ultimately transform not just individual lives, but entire systems of power and accountability. As Marcus boarded his flight that day, now as a passenger rather than captain, he carried with him the knowledge that the journey that had begun with his stand for Zoe Williams' dignity 3 years earlier continued to unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated. The ripples extended outward still, touching lives and transforming institutions in a testament to the enduring power of one person choosing to do what's right when confronted with what's wrong. The captain's voice came over the intercom as the aircraft prepared for departure. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. On behalf of our entire crew, I want to assure you that on this aircraft, every passenger will be treated with dignity and respect, without exception. That's our commitment to you and to each other." Marcus smiled, recognizing the words from the Reynolds protocol that had now become standard in pre-flight announcements throughout the industry. Some transformations began with grand declarations and sweeping initiatives. Others, perhaps the most meaningful ones, began with one person simply refusing to look away when principle was at stake. If you were moved by this story, if Captain Reynolds' stand for dignity and justice resonated with you, take a moment to like and share this video. Your engagement helps us bring more inspiring true stories of moral courage to audiences worldwide. Subscribe to our channel to receive notifications about our upcoming series on everyday heroes who've transformed their industries through principled leadership. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our exclusive interview with Dr. Nathan Williams and Zoe next month. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against injustice when it would have been easier to remain silent? Or have you been that person yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their courage when it matters most. Remember, true change often begins not with grand plans or movements, but with one person who refuses to compromise on fundamental human dignity. Be that person in your own sphere of influence.